Did the kings and the Pope gloat, thinking they had pulled the grass out by its roots? Ridiculous. History is rarely clean, and glamorous endings are usually just a spectacular, well-choreographed hoax. Do you think an unrivaled financial empire, fierce warriors whose hands were drenched in gold, blood, and earth-shattering secrets, would meekly fold their hands and wait for death? You are being far too naive. While all of Paris was still preoccupied with smelling the stench of burnt flesh and believing in something called God's justice, at fog-shrouded harbors and in the filthiest corners of Europe, a different play was truly beginning. They discarded their artificially pristine white cloaks and draped themselves in the black of darkness, of mourning, and of betrayal. Fleets evaporated without leaving a single broken plank behind. Nameless warriors without banners swept through Iberia, and heretical symbols silently proliferated beneath the catacombs of Scotland. Those broken-winged bats were not destroyed at all. They only learned how to evolve to become invisible. So, what really happened behind the velvet curtain reeking of the church's hypocrisy? Welcome, skeptical minds, to dark history. I am Zorro, and today we are not going to sit and listen to hymns. Together, we will dig through the ashes of the 14th century to see what those black-clad knights really hid beneath the grave. Fasten your seatbelts, because the truth has never been an easy pill to swallow. And just like that, snap. No elaborate rituals, no proper prayers. They light the fire. The flames consume the Grand Master's body, turning his mortal flesh into ashes drifting away in the cold wind. The audience thinks they are witnessing the final breath of the most terrifying brotherhood in the Christian world. Period. The book closes, but you know me by now. I despise those happily ever after or wiped out down to the last soul endings that history textbooks try to cram into our heads. The truth? The truth is always far more ironic. The witnesses standing near the pyre that day tremblingly whispered to one another that the moment the flames entirely engulfed his body, de Molay's final words were not a scream of repentance. It was a blood-soaked curse. He summoned King Philip IV and Pope Clement to appear before God's tribunal within exactly 1 year. And, call it divine intervention, or just a highly dramatic historical coincidence. Both of the most powerful men in Europe at the time lost their lives before the year 1314 came to a close. But let them rot away in their luxurious graves. What we care about does not lie within the corpses of the powerful. It lies in what began to stir and move the moment the fires in Paris died down. Just weeks after the execution, along the dark forest paths of Auvergne and the misty hills of Champagne, rumors began to swirl. Travelers swore they had seen ghosts, tall knights draped in black cloaks, their faces concealed beneath hoods. They didn't move like vagrants. They glided through the night with the calmness and iron discipline of the most elite military patrol. Yet, they absolutely did not carry the banner of any lord. A few sharp-eyed observers spotted an insignia on their tunics. It was a cross. But forget about the proud red cross on the white canvas of the Templars. This cross was dark, sometimes deep crimson like dried blood, sometimes pitch black as if stained by the very darkness of the underworld. They did not chant hymns. They did not participate in crusades. They knelt before no one. Once seen, they vanished, as fast as the blink of an eye. How do you think the authorities reacted? A large-scale heresy hunt? Inquisitors scouring every nook and cranny? Well, you are wrong. Nothing. A deafening silence. The French crown, at this time busy greedily snatching up every inch of land and treasure of the Templars, seemed to consider hunting these ghosts a waste of time. And the Church, they had just declared the Templar case closed. They would not be foolish enough to fan the flames of a new mess. What a convenient silence, isn't it? It is exactly like how an aristocratic family pretends that the dismembered corpse hidden in their wine cellar has been laid to rest, despite the floorboards creaking with terrifying sounds every night. But if you are me, you will see the puzzle pieces starting to fit together. These knights were not desperate remnants. Remnants do not know how to coordinate mounted patrols across 3 vast provinces. Remnants do not reuse obscure regional insignia dating back to the bloody Crusades. And then we have the story of a poor apprentice blacksmith in Limoges. He swore a solemn oath before God that late one night, 5 burly men, clad in armor, pushed open the door of his forge. Cold silver coins were tossed onto the table, the price for silence. They demanded repairs on intricately designed chainmail armor, a technology the blacksmith hadn't seen since the fall of Acre. Before dawn broke, those men dissolved into the night. But they left one thing behind. The blacksmith, still trembling, found a strange seal imprinted on the cold ashes near the hearth. A cross neatly enclosed within a circle, and right behind it, a snake coiled inward. A symbol that did not exist in any public document of the Templars. Yet, ironically, that very symbol naturally appeared on the margin of a worn-out 13th century ledger, hidden deep inside the monastery at Gisors, one of the most infamous Templar fortresses. The page had no title, only scribbled annotations in Latin, and a phrase repeated over and over like a ghostly incantation. Nigrum lumen custodit, the Black Light Guards. History rarely creates ghosts unless it is desperately trying to bury something deeper, darker. The Knights Templar stripped off their brilliant white uniforms to clothe themselves in darkness. They did not disband. They merely transformed into shadows, observers, and sometimes the architects manipulating events. It was a foggy morning, so still that you could hear the whisper of water lapping against the hull. News of the widespread arrests targeting the Templars had not yet leaked to every outpost, but if you were a sharp individual, you would smell the betrayal thickening in the air. Something terrible was about to descend, and the leaders of the Templars, with an intelligence network perhaps even sharper than the modern CIA, already knew it. La Rochelle was no dilapidated boat slip for fishermen. It was the true naval gem of the Templars, a strategically purpose-built fortress facing the vast Atlantic coast. Most importantly, it lay beyond the reach of the Pope's prying eyes, and closer to the freedom of the high seas than to the cheap justice of the king. And then, in early October of that year, just a few short days before King Philip IV waved his hand to order his hounds to deal a fatal blow to the Templar network across France, a miracle, or perhaps the greatest magic trick in history, occurred. At least a dozen massive ships of the order vanished. There was no official departure log, no merchant journal, no cargo receipt. They simply evaporated. Massive ships that just days before were anchored peacefully, their bellies full of grain, weapons, and perhaps even gold, now left nothing but hollow, empty spaces on the water's surface. Do you think someone can hide a fleet as easily as hiding a coin up their sleeve? The harbor workers, who who were sworn to silence but eventually let the truth leak, recounted what they saw. They whispered about figures moving swiftly in the dark of night, hoods pulled down to obscure their faces, crates made of sparse wood, and orders hissed through clenched teeth. A porter swore he saw a heavy sealed chest being carried onto a galley by mute men who absolutely did not utter a single word of French. But the most valuable detail came from someone else. He saw a flag fluttering on the mast. It was not the traditional white flag. It was a solid pitch-black banner with a faint red cross embroidered much smaller than regulations dictated. It was easy for royal officials to dismiss these testimonies, brushing them off as the hallucinations of harbor drunks. What dock isn't chaotic? But let me ask you this. Why, when royal agents raided La Rochelle a week later, did they roar in madness and anger because they came away empty-handed? And why, in early 1308, did the Vatican stealthily issue a secret directive to all coastal bishops along the Bay of Biscay, demanding they keep their eyes wide open to immediately report ships bearing unusual insignia, or manned by bearded men in military attire? If the order had truly been broken, if their end was nothing but piles of ash, what on earth was the church sweating buckets waiting for from the open sea? Of course, dreamers and cheap novel hunters will babble about treasure, that the fleet carried tons of gold, or the Holy Grail, or powerful relics. Well, wake up from your dream. There is a quieter, more realistic, and far more terrifying possibility. What that fleet carried was not wealth. They carried continuation. Lest we forget, the Knights Templar were not just beefcakes who knew how to swing swords. They were monsters of logistics. They were Europe's bankers, brilliant cartographers, architects who created secret corridors and intricate cryptography systems. Do you think they could run an empire stretching from the furnace of Jerusalem all the way to chilly Edinburgh without a plan B? La Rochelle was exactly that emergency exit. Look at what was left behind. In the dusty archives of a Spanish monastery, there is a record of a fleet of brothers setting sail bearing no flags but in silence. This phrase sits squarely in a 14th century ledger, right next to a ghostly symbol, a compass rose surrounded by 13 stars. You will never find this constellation in any public Templar document. Yet it was crudely carved with a dagger into the damp catacomb wall of a decommissioned preceptory in Bruges. Next to that compass were two letters repeated 7 times, NM. For decades, scholars have scratched their heads over these 2 letters, but to me, the answer is plain as day. Nigrum militum, the Black Knights, the exact same Latin phrase buried in obscure Vatican documents. The same presence linked to the black light seal at the Limoges Forge. This proves that the idea of a black order had been shaped, simmered, and prepared long before King Philip lit the execution pyre. And if you need more vivid proof, flip through a Genoese maritime journal from 1311. It recounts an encounter at sea that would send chills down the spines of even the most seasoned sailors. A Genoese merchant ship was stalked by 3 longships, flying no national flags. The men standing on those decks wore dark cloaks, their faces pale and soulless like corpses. They did not speak. They did not signal. They silently followed the Genoese vessel like ghosts on the water for 2 whole days. On the 3rd day, one drew extremely close. Close enough for the Genoese captain to see the carving on the bow, a cross and a snake coiled around it. A perfect match. The black light. So where did they go? A massive fleet cannot just evaporate into thin air. Scotland? Very likely a perfect land to hide among clans that always detested church interference. Portugal, where an organization named the Order of Christ cropped up suspiciously fast with money flows and rituals that were chillingly familiar, or the desolate islands of the Azores, where legends speak of warrior monks on horseback. Strangest of all, at the bottom of the ocean, along the mid-Atlantic ridge, hundreds of miles west of La Rochelle, modern oceanographers have found fragments of wooden shipwrecks reinforced with iron nails. Authentic medieval French style. Why did they set sail straight into uncharted waters? Ironically, the entire world is going crazy searching for the lost gold of the Templars, without realizing that their greatest treasure was the art of disappearance. A brotherhood that survived not through brute force, but by becoming shadows. The modern world calls it going black, covert operations, but centuries before intelligence agencies, governments, and radio waves were born, the Knights Templar invented it. They disappeared, but absolutely did not fall into oblivion. They hid for a purpose. And I must remind you, if a fleet has disappeared once, what could stop them from setting sail again? White is the color of integrity, of unblemished, holy purity. At least, that was the illusion the Knights Templar used to preach and blindly believe in. Recall their familiar image, snow-white cloaks punctuated by a brilliant deep red cross so vivid it seemed to bleed against the backdrop of purity. It wasn't just a cheap uniform, it was a steel message. A declaration roared to the entire world about a divine mission, humility and service, and the sworn drops of blood spilled for a noble ideal. But, you see, ideals usually burn to death very quickly on the pyre of betrayal. At some point after the order collapsed, the color palette shifted. Records from this period are incredibly scattered, silent as graves. An old priest in Poitiers tremblingly wrote in his diary about strange visitors descending from the mountains. They wore solid, pitch-black cloaks, dark as a starless sky, with only a crimson thread border so narrow it was nearly invisible. And if you think that old priest was senile, look at a rotting piece of tapestry unearthed in an abandoned monastery near Lyon. The tapestry depicts a knight kneeling before a sacred altar. But oh no, his cloak is not white. It bears a dull, faded dark color, a deathly shade of black, and the proud red cross of yesteryear. It is still there, but sewn with threads so thin it is almost hidden, buried within the folds of the black cloth. At first glance, a few pretentious scholars might shrug and declare just artistic expression or a weaver's dye-mixing error. But no, my friend. As reports of this unorthodox attire piled up, that foolish justification no longer held water. Think about it for a second. Why would these great former knights, now bearing the status of exiles hunted like wild beasts, drape themselves in a new color? In the Latin Western world of that era, black was never the color of glory or knighthood. It was the embodiment of death, of tearful penance, of unspeakable secrets and permanent rejection. That black garment had much more in common with ascetic monks in underground crypts than with proud warriors on the battlefield. A few sentimental theories suggest that black was a sign of mourning, a bleak, sorrowful nod to the demise of the Templars. Sounds plausible enough, a dirge woven in cloth. But that garbage theory cannot explain why these black garments not only failed to fade, but actually evolved. From the tattered rags of fugitives by the 15th century, They had become sleek black uniforms, tailored to strict military standards with exclusive insignia. The clearest clue lies in an ancient manuscript closely guarded at the Biblioteca Nazionale in Florence. On the margin of a crusade chronicle, someone meticulously penned a bizarre note. The writer described a chilling encounter with men who once belonged to the temple but now clothed themselves in night, and accompanying it was a phrase, an oath of a new ritual, ex tenebris lux. From darkness, light. That phrase took root, stretched its tentacles, and became a motto hissed through the clenched teeth of secret brotherhoods. Even today, if you have the courage to venture to a ruined Templar chapel in southern Italy, you will still see it deeply engraved on the gray stone archway. Casting off white was not a surrender. It was a rebirth. Spitting on the identity punished by the corrupt church, these knights embraced a new creed. A creed forged in the furnace of betrayal and days of exile. A creed that despised the dirty politics of Rome and slipped from the clutches of kings. They learned to speak in silence and to stand tall in broad daylight without anyone knowing. Of course, this transition was not uniform across the European chessboard. In Castile, the Knights of the Order of Montesa still clung to traditional white, but deep within the remote lands of Iberia, people whispered about wandering bands of horsemen conducting rituals under the moonlight. They wore black cloaks and wielded blades, engraved with ghostly characters. Do you want authentic proof? Ask the unfortunate notary in Aragon. He accidentally stumbled into a forbidden gathering deep in the forest. 3 days later, they found him. He was no longer a sane man. He was trembling like a dog with its tail between its legs, his pale lips sealed tight, unable to utter a sound. His hands were contorted, tightly clutching a scroll sealed in red wax. The imprint on it? Concentrated circles, and right in the center, an inverted cross. No, don't rush to cry out about satanic blasphemy. In their world, the inverted cross was not heresy. It was the ultimate symbol of absolute secrecy. They did not hide their attire. On the contrary, they intentionally wore it. The black coat lined with deep crimson inside, a complete inversion of the old Templar vestment, was a message coded in fabric. To the peasants or passing travelers, they were just a ragtag bunch of mercenaries. But to those who had once shared bread and blood, those who had witnessed the Grand Master turn to ash, that inverted black cloak was a scream of fury. A brilliant beacon in the night signaling, "We are not dead. We have only evolved." And we cannot ignore the eerie spectacle in the Jura Mountains. The year 1323, Holy Easter week. Local abbots sent urgent, trembling letters to the bishop in Besançon, reporting a ghostly procession. Warriors wrapped in black cloaks trudged through the snow-covered mountain pass. They made no demands. They made no threats. They left no footprints. They simply drifted away in absolute silence and were swallowed by the dense forest. Decades later, that event was engraved onto a bone-chilling woodblock print. A solitary knight, his face entirely consumed by the shadow of his hood, standing at the edge of an abyss looking toward the setting sun. The caption underneath was cold as ice. Custodes Umbrarum, the guardians of shadows. So, why black? Was it just a cheap disguise? No. In a world that had ruthlessly turned its back on them, the Knights Templar stopped the illusion of trying to reflect divine glory. Instead, they chose to absorb the darkness. They opened their arms to welcome it, drank it dry, contained it within their chests, and forged it into an unbreakable resolve. And as a final parasitic detail to burrow into your mind, some of these black-clad knights carried strange metal pendants, engraved with a wheel of 7 spokes. 7 spokes. A circle, and always made of pitch-black metal. You will never find this in the Christian Bible. It is a symbol of Gnosticism, sects holding forbidden knowledge that the church was ready to burn anyone alive for touching. This symbol appears repeatedly, from torn pages to rusted iron shields dug up in Toulouse. Nothing here is a coincidence. Everything is ritualistic, coordinated, and extremely deliberate. The black cloak was just the beginning, a bloody signal, an oath worn straight upon the flesh, not for the vulgar masses to gaze at, but for those sharing the same black blood, to recognize one another. Castile, Aragon, Leon, or even that tiny land of Navarre pinned between ancient blood feuds. These were not just inanimate patches of color on a map. They were the frantically pulsing pressure points of a fractured medieval Europe, a Europe desperately groping to find boundaries within its own shadow. While the church screeched and wagged its fingers in reproach, and France eagerly sharpened its executioner's axes, the Iberian monarchies caught the scent of leverage from the massive corpse of the Templars. Official history always leaves blank spaces, and I bet you it's intentional. Take King Ferdinand IV of Castile, for instance. In a mystery-shrouded decree from 1313, he mumbled incomprehensible words about the silent watchmen of Santiago. He granted them freedom of movement across coastal regions. In exchange for what? Silence and service. No names, no sigils. It was essentially a blank check written in Latin, a tacit agreement with ghosts. On paper, Europe simultaneously eradicated the Templars, but under the table in Iberia, the picture was far murkier and more cunning. While French henchmen savagely tortured knights to death, what did Castile and Aragon do? They hesitated. They arrested a few, conducted perfunctory interrogations just for show, and then quietly flung the dungeon doors open to release them. Others were simply advised to reconsider their vows. And a select few? They evaporated without leaving a trace. Glance through a worn 1315 ledger from a monastery in Burgos. There is an eerily bizarre notation. Brother Juan of Jerusalem, along with 6 foreign companions, arrived seeking shelter. 3 weeks later, they left a massive donation and vanished completely. Their receipt was not stamped with the familiar red cross seal, but rather a lump of pitch-black wax molded into the shape of 2 crossed swords. No one knows where they went. Only that afterward, that monastery was suddenly showered with funds for reinforcement from an anonymous patron. That was when the legend of El Paso Negro, the Black Pass, sprouted. Seasoned sailors in Santander often whispered about black-cloaked figures emerging from the dense fog of the Bay of Biscay. They spoke a bizarre language, mixing Latin and Occitan, tossing out cold gold coins to buy silence and safe passage inland. A sea shanty, casual debris accidentally transcribed in the 16th century, still preserves their bone-chilling moniker. Los Caballeros del Humo, the Knights of Smoke. They rode the waves while the king turned a blind eye. Don't be quick to think it's just a cheap fairy tale. In the late 19th century, during the restoration of an ancient tower in Oviedo, workers accidentally awakened a secret buried deep underground, a subterranean crypt. Faintly carved into the stone foundation was a compass rose, the exact same symbol that appeared in the Genoese Maritime Journal centuries prior. 7 spokes, a flanking snake, and a resolute Latin phrase scraped into the mind. Nulla retrorsum, never step back. And we have the Order of Calatrava, a legitimate brotherhood of Spanish warriors that luckily survived the purge. But strangely, from around 1315, their ranks suddenly swelled abnormally. The membership roster was thick with new names annotated with the phrase Transitus ex Oriente, journey from the east. Ironically, dozens of entries conspicuously left the names entirely blank. Could these be former Knights Templar? Absolutely. They discarded that fatal white cross to enter a new allegiance, or perhaps simply signed a blood and mud pact of silence with one another. Another piece of the puzzle, a 1317 secret report from a royal advisor in Zaragoza. He wrote about bands of foreign knights, armed to the teeth with pockets stuffed with cash, camping along the border. They served no throne. The advisor's tone was not one of outrage, but written with a trembling awe, as if describing something immortal. He noted a fatal detail. These knights wore cloaks with a red lining on the inside. A complete inversion of the Templar vestments. To the ignorant commoners, they looked ordinary, but to those holding the old codes, that inversion was a deafening scream, roaring ultimate defiance. They even left their own fingerprints directly on the baptismal fonts of rural Castile. Go to a small stone church in Segovia. Look at the font carved with heretical circles and spirals. Engraved upon it is the phrase, Renati in Flamma, reborn in flame. What a ridiculous phrase for a holy Christian sacrament, yet a flawless oath for those who watched their world burn to ash with their own eyes and still coldly chose to press on. These were no coincidences. They were tracks intentionally left behind, not through gold or glorious feats, but through architecture, through inverted fabric linings, and through absolute muteness. But if you truly want to evaporate from this world, nowhere is more spectacular than the misty highlands of Scotland. Wild, broken, boiling with rebellious blood, and most importantly, entirely no stranger to blood oaths hissed in the dark. The year 1307. The exact year Jacques de Molay was thrown into a French dungeon. In the north, King Robert the Bruce had also just been excommunicated by the Pope for stabbing his rival to death right in the middle of a cathedral, a cursed king, an outlaw kingdom that despised the power of Rome. Do you see the perfection of this picture? For a highly wanted knight, with no loyalty left other than the instinct to survive, a criminal king is the greatest ally. The fall of the Knights Templar was never a complete, satisfying ending like historians want you to believe. It was merely the moment the snake shed its skin. History did not die in the fires of Paris. It only went underground, wrapped itself in black cloaks, smiled and patiently waited. Do you believe in coincidences? I don't. In my world, coincidence is usually just a clumsy play to cover up contracts signed in blood in the dark. Look at early 14th century European history. Is it a laughably accidental thing that the years of Robert the Bruce's brilliant rise and advancement in Scotland match perfectly, precise to every single heartbeat, with the bloody collapse of the Knights Templar. Mainstream history will wave its hand and tell you, "Oh, Zorro, stop the conspiracy theories. There are no direct records linking Bruce to the Templars." True. There isn't a single scrap of paper with an official seal confirming that. But you and I both know, in major cases, sometimes the absence of evidence is the loudest scream. Look at England, where kings obediently rounded up their knights for sacrifice. Look at Spain, where rulers meticulously recorded their leniency as a way to show off. And the Scottish Church? Empty, indifferent, closed off. They maintained an astonishing silence, a strained stillness masking the undercurrent storm. Scattered here and there were only a few scraps of paper mentioning foreign brothers requesting an audience, or a suggestive line in the Chronicles of St. Andrews about an order that arrived, but never left. Like ghosts, they walked into the Highland mist and evaporated from the history books. Until the Battle of Bannockburn broke out, the year 1314. Imagine it. Mushy mud, the smell of rusted iron mingling with the pungent stench of blood. Bruce's army, with inferior numbers, was humiliating the proud might of the Kingdom of England. Historians have long blathered on about unconventional tactics, lightning flank maneuvers, and Bruce's razor-sharp timing. But they usually ignore one detail, a glorious last-minute twist: the appearance of an anonymous armored cavalry unit. Contemporary English records spit right in the faces of modern historians. Surviving English soldiers described their terror regarding new cavalry, unidentified reinforcements. One account even tremblingly drew a clear line: "Knights bearing crosses, but not our men." Where did they come from? Out of the nearby dense, bustling forest, they charged out like armored beasts, delivering a fatal blow that crushed English morale, and then disappeared again, asking for no glory, declaring no names. Today's scholars try to stuff this event into a safe box called the fog of war, or hyperbolic literary device. But it's ridiculous. How can you ignore figures cloaked with the sign of the cross, tearing across the battlefield without belonging to any flag? Surely you remember the legend of the Black Cloaks. In Scotland, where time and decay spare no one, clothing from that era has almost turned to dust. Yet deep in the archives of a quiet museum in Stirling, a fragment of dark woolen cloth remains locked away, thick, rough, stitched with a skill that sends shivers down your spine. It was found near the Bannockburn battlefield. No family crest, no titles, but hidden within its border is a thread pattern. An exact match, repeating stitch for stitch, the characteristic embroidery art of the Knights Templar. The blind will call it a coincidence. The skeptic will scream that it's a fake. But the dark fabric itself refuses to speak. It just sits there cold, defying the limits of time. The next clue pulls us underground beneath Rosslyn Chapel. Even though this structure was built by the Sinclair clan over a century later, their blood had long been soaked in Templar lore. William Sinclair traced his lineage all the way back to the very first Crusader Knights. Step into Rosslyn. Don't look at the angels or the bizarre Masonic geometry predating Columbus. Look into the hidden corner. There is a carving of a solitary knight, clad in full body armor, wearing what looks like a black surcoat, and behind him, etched deep into the cold stone is a cross so faint you might miss it if you only glance. But do you know what the most interesting part is? This hidden sanctuary of Scotland wasn't just bartered for blood or stone. It afforded those being hunted an ultimate luxury: time. Far from the prying eyes and raging pyres of continental Europe, the unpeopled stretches of the Highlands became the perfect incubator. The MacDonald and Campbell clans to this day still whisper around campfires about quiet horsemen. They brought gold and ancient books, not swords and spears to demand titles. They taught the ancestors of the Scots about the geometry of fortresses, military knowledge impossible for simple shepherds to possess. Some even assert these strangers came only to kneel and pray beneath the freezing northern sky. And then, in 1320, the Declaration of Arbroath was born. The infamous letter from the Scottish nobility thrust directly in the face of Pope John XXII to assert independence. Yet, how ironic, its tone reeked of divine justice, brotherhood, and redemption after betrayal. Sound familiar? It is practically a carbon copy, a verbatim repetition, of the steel-willed outcries that the Knights Templar threw in the faces of judges when put on trial to the bitter end just a decade prior. A casual borrowing of phrasing, or an alliance directed by ghosts. It's still not over. Just recently, an excavation at the ruins of a chapel near Inverness, believed to have been abandoned since the 15th century, exposed a hidden crypt. In that dark, suffocating alcove lay fragments of unreadable, rotting manuscripts and a relief carving depicting a ship cutting through waves. But on its sail was not the proud red cross on the white background of the ancient temple. It was a black cross, the color of ash, the color of night. At first, you might think a pack of broken, desperately hunted people from across Europe sought the chaos of Scotland merely to draw their final breaths. But think a little deeper, like a true detective. What they needed most at that time was not wealth, not a good night's sleep. What they craved was space. They needed time to reforge broken swords and shattered oaths. They needed time to rewrite a harsher, new dogma. And perhaps they needed time to kill their former selves. The Black Templars, yes, I think it's time we call them by that name, did not scream to reclaim past glories. They were casting a new future. A future independent of any mortal king or greedy pope, but rather a devotion to an older, more terrifying silence. And as they advanced deeper north, the space grew quieter. So quiet that you could hear the stones begin to whisper of a resurrection. Amidst that darkness, they did not die out. They were simply shedding their skin. If you only skim the surface of early 14th century European history, Portugal probably wouldn't even catch your eye. It was like an orphan sitting isolated on the western edge of the continent, its petty internal squabbles completely swallowed by the bloody chaos of papal decrees and dynastic purges on the mainland. But my friend, never let the peace deceive you. Pick up a magnifying glass and look deep into that quiet edge. You will find something that slaps orthodox truth right in the face. A spark of continuation, brilliant and agonizing, right in the middle of the pitch-black hole left by the collapse of the temple. It wasn't screaming rebellions. It wasn't desperate resistance. It was a calculated rebirth. Everything began, as history so often repeats itself, from a crack of greed and power. Let's get acquainted with King Dinis of Portugal. Unlike the fanaticism of his neighboring kings, Dinis was a ruthlessly pragmatic man. When the Pope officially brought down the gavel to execute the Knights Templar in 1312, Dionys found himself caught in a nutcracker scenario. For a long time, his kingdom had grown fat on the immense wealth and infrastructure of this order. Towering fortresses, fertile fields, and massive shipyards. Uproot them? That would be like slashing his own face and weakening the kingdom. But openly slapping the Pope in the face to protect heretics? That was a one-way ticket to hell. So what would a crafty king do? He did exactly what scandalous corporations do today to whitewash themselves: rebranding. In 1319, with a shady nod and a turned blind eye from the Pope himself, Dionys molded the Order of Christ. Order of Christ. On the surface, it was a brand new, pious, clean military brotherhood created to inherit the assets and mission of the fallen Knights Templar. Splendid, isn't it? At least that's what was written in the proclamation. But pull back that veil of hypocrisy. Who was the core force of this new order? Ridiculous. There was no one new. Most of them were the exact same scruffy-bearded former Knights Templar, reeking of the battlefield. History records that they simply took knives, grit their teeth, tore the flaming red Templar cross off their tunics, and carefully stitched another cross right over it. Just like that, they were cleansed. Their blood oath was still there. The hierarchical military command system remained completely intact. Even their bone-chilling rituals, now wrapped in sleek language and layers of ambiguous fog, continued to pulse right under the new name. Did the church know? Absolutely. But they tolerated this farcical play. After all, Portugal was not France, which was suffocating in the stench of burning human flesh. Here, there were fewer inquisitors throwing wrenches into the gears, fewer prying eyes, and most importantly, fewer fires burning people alive. The Order of Christ was nothing more than an excellent political prophylactic, a safe cover to harbor the most dangerous men in Europe. But do you know what happens when you lock a monster in a cage with an open door? The cover begins to deform. The initial cowardly compromise gradually grew fangs, evolving into strength and a terrifying purpose. Look at Gil Martins, one of the first Grand Masters of the Order of Christ, who once knelt in direct service under the Templar banner. His seal initially bore a typical pious 8-pointed cross, but in his final years, as death drew near and secrets demanded to be voiced, that cross began to be swallowed by a circle of stars, a pagan motif that had never stained the order before. If you curiously flip through a surviving manuscript from that time, look closely at the margin of the page. There is a tiny, bizarre, and spine-chilling additional drawing. A miniature ship rowing headlong toward the west, and beneath it is a whispered phrase, "Non-exit lux." The light does not fade. That light, it seems, did not die. It only retreated underground. The most bone-chilling transformation lay in Tomar itself, the old fortified stronghold of the Knights Templar, and now, by coincidence, the headquarters of the Order of Christ. Archive records reveal a strange, almost frantic explosion of architectural demolition and rebuilding in the 1320s. If you step inside, watch your step. You will encounter secret staircases leading into the darkness, fake chapels erected like stage sets, and hollow, empty rooms without any official purpose. Most goosebump-inducing of all is a buried room, only unearthed in the 20th century. Carved into the stone floor is a jagged map of the Mediterranean, yet dotted with 4 islands that do not exist on any nautical chart, along with a compass rose bearing 7 sharp points. There is that ghostly seal again. There is that mystery mocking the living. Looking from the outside world, the Order of Christ were model citizens. They fought fiercely in the Reconquista, built churches like mushrooms after rain, and even threw money to fund the first ocean voyages along the Atlantic coast. Too perfect a disguise. But inside those bustling stone walls, something older and darker was boiling. An unwritten creed. It was passed from hand to hand, preserved in blood and darkness through secret rituals. Not a rewritten law to be obeyed, but a rule being reborn. And here is the black pearl of history, a tattered document surviving among the personal correspondence of Prince Henry the Navigator, the most prominent face of the order. In 1434, decades after people believed the Knights Templar had been exterminated down to their roots, Prince Henry wrote a letter thanking an anonymous master belonging to the Inner Brotherhood. What did he thank him for? For the encoded maps and the compass of twilight. The tone of a proud prince turned groveling, sickeningly submissive before this nameless ghost, and what sends a chill down my spine. Right beneath Henry's signature, there looms a faint version of the Templar cross, but it does not have the red color of Christ's blood. It bears the black of stillness. So now, the question posed to us is, was Portugal a compassionate refuge after all? Or had it been transformed into a vessel of power? Because if the Black Templars truly survived, they couldn't just keep fleeing and hiding like rats forever. They needed a solid skeleton, a territory to take root in, and a legitimate cover. Portugal, whether intentionally or accidentally, served all 3 things to them on a silver platter. They donned the name Knights of Christ, but the pulse in their chests was still consumed by the same ancient hellfire. Rigid historical minds will click their tongues and say, it's all just speculation. But if it were merely a repurposed patriotic military order, then why breed this suffocating secrecy? Why did pagan symbols sprout like mushrooms? Why this centuries-long obsession that something sacred and terrifying was being strictly guarded in the dark, far beyond the dull pages of the scriptures? If you still don't believe me, step deep with me into the Corolla, the dark, round chapel located in the belly of the Convent of Christ in Tomar. The 4 walls of stone are packed tight with images of knights and angels with faces scratched away by time. But in the most hidden corner near the main altar, hidden behind a patch of faded, jagged paint, restorers in 1997 found a secret that slaps history right in the face. A rugged sculpture carving the figure of a man. He wears a pitch-black cloak. His head is bowed low, and tightly rolled in his rough hands is a scroll depicting a snake tightly squeezing a cross. That relief was never created for the sunlight to touch, but someone in the cold breath of the chapel intentionally carved it into stone as a message cast through time. A razor-sharp reminder. The rule of the Knights Templar was never shattered. It merely changed its name, moved to a new estate, and under the blazing sun of Portugal, it quietly, patiently learned to survive to wait for the day of vengeance. Fleeing into the Alps meant surrendering your life to the mountain. Yet the Black Templars, if the vague reports from the past are worth our attention, did exactly that crazy thing. The 14th century witnessed a strange boom of records from remote alpine monasteries. Monks, men who spent their whole lives in stillness, began to tremblingly write about inexplicable encounters. What did they see? Armored cavalry units draped in dark, gloomy cloaks, moving in a terrifyingly disciplined formation. Straining one's eyes, a faded red cross could faintly be seen, so dim it was almost swallowed by the darkness. They didn't beg for shelter. They didn't utter a word. They just silently rode past like ghosts. At first, people clicked their tongues, thinking it was just a local militia or the ragged remnants of some unlucky crusade group that had lost its way. But wait. The truth always likes to play tricks on the superficial. Anomalies quickly smacked observers right in the face. These horsemen carried no lordly insignia. They rode in a deadly silence. And the most bone-chilling part? Many monks swore in their records that the hoofprints of these strangers on the snow simply ended. Not faded away by the wind and snow, but stopped completely, as if they had ridden straight into another dimension. Open with me a meticulously decorated manuscript from the St. Bernard Monastery, dated 1336. A beautiful piece of art, yet bearing a suffocating atmosphere. On one page, the silhouette of a hooded rider on horseback slowly descends from the thick fog. Flipping to the next page, there is that exact same silhouette, but standing inside a chapel. He has removed his helmet, revealing a pale, cold face, so soulless that no emotion could be read. And in the corner of the page, scribbled in black ink like a sudden flash of terror in the illustrator's mind, is the phrase, Milites Obscuri, the Knights of Shadows. This ghostly phrase would vanish for the next 60 years, but here, right on this parchment, it was stamped like a devil's fingerprint. Historically, this rugged, mountainous region used to be a lucrative backyard for the Knights Templar. They scattered small commanderies across the Alpine passes, extending their octopus tentacles all over Savoy and the Rhone Valley. When the Great Purge broke out, on paper these assets were quietly stuffed into the pockets of the Knights Hospitallers. But ridiculously, not a single handover protocol was signed. The lands, fortresses, catacombs, they were simply taken away by someone. Now, fast forward to the late 1800s. Next to Chamonix, a completely collapsed tunnel was excavated from the old belly of a Templar mountain. Inside that stone stomach, what did they find? Rusted swords bitten heavily by soil, candle stubs burnt out centuries ago, and a cold metal ceremonial cup engraved with the words, Lux Absentia, light from absence. In the corner of the crypt, mixed within the rubble, were a few fragments of a tattered flag. The black fabric had stiffened from the cruelty of time, embroidered with a red insignia now blurred beyond decoding. But on one fragment, the Latin letter M could be read. Conservative scholars scratched their chins and judged. Ah, it stands for militum of the Knights. But those who know how to look into the darkness smirked, remembering another phrase, Nigrum militum, the same phrase scribbled in the margin of the manuscript in Florence. The same phrase whispered by the wise in Iberia. There is that dark order again. You're probably thinking I'm losing my mind again, stringing together disjointed pieces of folklore just to sell you a sensationalized myth, right? But my friend, its consistency is so tight it makes you sick. Imagine it. Monks living precariously in completely isolated monasteries in completely different decades, all describing the exact same phenomenon. Knights suddenly appearing on holy feast days, drifting like shadows through the valley, stopping by the chapel for a quick prayer, then whipping their horses straight back into the endless mist. They didn't rob anyone, nor were they pilgrims. They were something far darker. The most spine-chilling of all has to be the log of a monk at Dissentis Abbey. Close your eyes and visualize. It's the hour of matins, the frost biting deep to the bone. The monk is awakened by the clicking of horse hooves clacking on cobblestones. He pushes open the door and steps out. In the dark courtyard, 5 pitch-black riders have dismounted, their heads bowed low. Quiet as ghosts, they glide into the chapel, kneel for exactly 10 minutes, and leave. Not a single redundant noise. The old monk tremblingly noted in his diary that the air at that moment reeked of a bizarre taste, a blend of rusted metal and heavy incense. And before dissolving into the mist, one of them whispered a phrase that would haunt the monk to his grave. "The guardian does not knock." Years later, in a small village down the valley, a peasant family swore on their lives that they had been paid in pure gold florins. Paid by whom? Travelers dressed in solid black. Paid for what? For supplying provisions to a camp hidden somewhere deep inside the bowels of the mountain. Under interrogation by the authorities, the peasant father maintained that those people spoke Latin so fluently that even the nobility would be jealous. On their hands, they wore blunt silver rings with no family crest, engraved only with a single, hideous circular emblem. Yes, the 7-pointed compass rose yet again. The Alps seemed to have gone far beyond the role of a mere refuge. It was the ultimate cloak of invisibility. From the sunless, dense forests of Valais to the gaping, forgotten caves of Tyrol, the mountain opened its mouth to swallow roads, lick footprints clean, and camouflage fortresses to blend into the cliffs. If the Black Templars wanted to march right under the noses of European powers without being sniffed out, there was no highway more perfect than the Alps. And if they needed a locked room to plot their schemes and conduct heretical rituals, what greater cathedral was there than a snow-covered plateau witnessed only by the emotionless stars? It was a desperate 15th century letter from a disgraced Swiss cleric that accidentally lifted this curtain. He wrote about a bitterly freezing midwinter night near Lake Geneva, a secret gathering of the men of the mantleless oath. They marched in pairs, quiet as clams. Each man clutched a document carefully sealed in wax, bearing the image of a black snake. The cleric called them Custodes Tenebrae, the guardians of darkness. That crazy gathering lasted exactly one night. A few days later, when the cleric gathered enough courage to track back to that spot, everything had been wiped clean by the snow, leaving nothing behind except a perfect circle arranged from black stones. Armchair scholars will continue to scoff, black-clad knights riding horses in the snow and silence. Well, let me tell you, this wasn't the era of satellite cameras or border control via retinal scans. An organization with iron discipline, excess money, and excess ruthlessness could completely move like toxic winds through the canyons, paying cash, kneeling, and evaporating. The Black Templars elevated that skill to an art form. It's too easy for us to wave our hands and say these horsemen were just the product of paranoid minds on long winter nights. But this pattern repeats too regularly, too deliberately. Pilgrimages without temples, guards, wandering without protecting any kingdom, messages delivered without paperwork, all of it screams intentionality. And here is the thought that truly gives me chills. What if they weren't? just passing through? What if they had taken root there? What if the deadly Alps wasn't just a highway for fugitives, but the great rocking cradle incubating their brutal rebirth? Before 1307, the Knights Templar had plunged their blood-sucking tentacles all over this region. Modest commanderies, a few dilapidated chapels, a handful of fortified farms. Logically, after that year's bloody suppression, these places should have been stripped clean, belongings stringently inventoried, and the walls mercilessly bared. Yet, ridiculously, as centuries passed, people kept stumbling upon traces proving the exact opposite. They never left. This place was never abandoned. It was occupied in the shadows. The first spine-chilling clue exploded in 1622 when bricklayers were painstakingly renovating a decaying monastery on the outskirts of Epinal. When they tore down an innocuous stone wall, mortar and dust crashed down, revealing a narrow, pitch-dark passageway leading straight into a tightly sealed chamber. What did the workers find? 3 bone-white skeletons. Strangely, they were still wearing rusted chainmail armor colored by time, their hands tightly gripping blunted swords. One of the 3 corpses wore a silver ring set with a glossy black onyx stone, with a cross neatly enclosed within a circle etched into the stone. And here is what takes our breath away. In the corner of the room was a box holding a scroll that had crumbled to ash ages ago, but the wax seal remained. A pitch-black, cracked piece of wax bearing the image of a 2-headed eagle being strangled by hideous snakes. Upon hearing the news, the local bishop rushed to the scene, his face completely drained of blood. He immediately waved his hand and ordered absolute silence. The remains were hastily reburied, and the room was bricked up as if it had never existed. But he couldn't muzzle a curious monk. That monk secretly noted this bone-chilling discovery in his personal journal, tremblingly calling the 3 corpses the preservers of oaths that can no longer be spoken. And Epinal was no exception. Look at the Senones Abbey in the 18th century. An inventory accidentally leaked information about secret underground cells lying deep beneath the library's floorboards. Close your eyes and imagine a pitch-dark room, a creaking wooden bench, a solitary candlestick, and a stone basin stained by a dark liquid that had dried hundreds of years ago. Deeply engraved on the cold wall was a Latin inscription that slaps the curiosity of anyone who enters. Videre est tacere. To see is to be silent. Local residents here still pass down tales of les moines d'ombre, the monks of shadow. They drifted listlessly through the monasteries, not wearing the familiar white or brown habits. Their attire was of a single, solid pitch black. They didn't open their mouths to sing hymns, nor did they bother to hold out their hands to beg for food. They fasted in a deadly silence, vanishing before dawn, and never once had their names in the monastery registries. The naive might think they came with the winter storms. As for me, I believe they nested deep within the stone, living in parallel right beneath the feet of those pious clerics, forming a terrifying second underground church. The pinnacle of the bazaar was at the ruins of a monastery plowed over during the 30 Years' War. It hid a side chapel, and you could only crawl inside through a secret rotating stone slab located right behind the main altar. Villagers whispered among themselves, calling it La Chambre du Serpentin, the Chamber of the Snake. Though mainstream historians pouted and dismissed it as never verified. During an excavation in the 1930s, hackers and archaeologists fell silent when they dug up a foundation stone carved with a 7-spoked wheel. Sound familiar? Yes, that's it. The ghostly symbol that sat proudly upon the baptismal fonts in Iberia lingered in the catacombs of Scotland and mocked the living beneath the convent of Christ in Portugal. This stubborn repetition transcends all borders, languages, and time. It cannot be a prank of chance. It is a visual code, a blazing torch passed from generation to generation by those dressed in black. But if stones only know silence, music knows how to claw at the eardrums of history. Tucked away in a pile of musical scrap paper at Luxeuil Abbey, someone dug up an anonymous hymn titled Ordo sub Rosa, the Order under the Rose. The lyrics are a diabolical mess. It praises fire, darkness, the stars, and the stillness of those who do not drink blood from the holy chalice, but from an iron cup. Its melody, dissonant, haunting. It wears the guise of liturgical music, but hypnotizes the listener in an evil way. Modern musicians trying to replay this piece break into a cold sweat, admitting that this music wasn't written to be performed for God. It was written to summon something, and if that still isn't enough to smash your skepticism, flip through the registry of seals of the monasteries in this region from the 14th century. The familiar flaming red Templar cross still sits proudly there, but it has been deformed, distorted. Some are tilted, strangled by vines. Some are flipped upside down, locked tightly inside a pitch-black circle. Another seal kept in Strasbourg frames the cross among 7 stars. Let me tell you, not a single one of these variations is present in the Church's official dictionary of symbols. Yet, they are perfectly scattered across the exact same monasteries rumored to host the silhouettes of those monks of shadow. Do you think the Vatican is holy and blind? Don't make me laugh. Beneath the splendid gilded domes and glamorous frescoes of Rome lies a deep cavern, locking away things deemed too dangerous or too inconvenient to be brought to light. Among those moldy-bound ledgers exists a death list, Catalogus Ordinum Non-Conformium, the catalog of non-conforming orders. It was never allowed to be public, but the heavyweights of the Vatican have always whispered about it. In 1451, a Vatican archivist, sweating buckets, wrote a letter to a bishop in Avignon with a single shocking line of warning. Be vigilant, there are whispers of Nigrum Militum within the German borders. Cross-reference with registry entry 14Q Obscura. Nigrum Militum, the Black Knights. That name again, but this time it isn't lying rusted in some corner of Europe. It sits squarely within the top secret communication texts of the Vatican itself. It has been logged, classified. It is a real organization, a flesh and blood nightmare for the ruling elite. A Jesuit monk in Milan, before dying, managed to secretly copy a portion of that bloody 14Q Obscura entry. The copy plainly states, the order believed to be extinct after the year 1312. Characteristics: black habits, modified Templar insignia, declares no loyalty to church or crown. Read closely. Modified. That damn word is the blade that rips open the veil of secrecy. The church didn't write somewhat similar or coincidental. They used the word modified, meaning those people were the real deal, authentic Knights Templar. They were just playing a game of changing clothes to mock the whole world. In the tiny footnote at the very bottom, the monk tremblingly added, "The insignia is a black cross inside a solar eclipse motif." A solar eclipse motif. The very thing sitting proudly in Castile, in the Vosges, in Portugal. So why, possessing earth-shattering power, did the Vatican stand by with folded arms? Cowardice or sheer terror? After the tangled mess of burnings and interrogations in 1307, perhaps the cardinals sweated bullets, realizing they had angered a monster they no longer had the strength to chain up. Not every enemy is foolish enough to fly flags, beat their chests, proclaim their names, and ram their heads into city walls. There are those who know how to slide beneath the floor tiles, surviving by blending into the shadow. Hear the final confession of an anonymous inquisitor from 1478. He fumbled his way down into a crypt in Verona to investigate a group of black cloaks gathering at night. His report is hair-raising. They meet beneath the chapel. Not a single soul speaks. All wear rings. A bowl of oil left unlit. When they saw me, there was no panic, only immobility. I departed in haste, and I never returned. He concluded the report not with his real name, but crossed out a trembling crucifix along with a closing statement sharp as a razor. Non est ordo, est vigil. It is not an order, it is a watch. The deeper you dig, the more clearly you will see the masterclass political game of the Vatican. Control through ignorance. Surveillance without confrontation. As long as those Black Templars don't carry swords to cut off the Pope's head, just let them drift invisibly in the shadows. After all, the Vatican is a city built on whispers. While one person carries a torch, hunting relentlessly in a hidden corner, another smiles, folding his arms to watch the watchman do the work of the night. Perhaps some high-level factions within the church believed that the remnants of the temple, the Black Templars, had shouldered some sacred responsibility. Perhaps they were tolerated by the Pope not out of fear, but out of a desperate necessity. Sure, no official acknowledgement was ever issued. The church never threw them a certificate of merit, but unofficially, their presence lurked in documents like ghosts imprinted on carbon paper. And so, the record books still exist, silently, moldering in the ultimate hidden corner of the Vatican vaults. Not organized alphabetically, no barcodes or indexing systems. They simply sit there, waiting. Because the church, my friend, never forgets. They only paste a restricted access label onto their memory. Leave warm Rome. Leave the fire still reeking of burning human flesh in Paris 1314. We will pull up our hoods, stepping into the bone-chillingly cold marshlands of the Baltic border. Because there, the sword of God is being wielded by entirely different hands. In Livonia, meaning the region of modern-day Latvia and Estonia today, amid dense coniferous forests and rivers frozen solid like corpses, the Teutonic Knights hold dominion. Let me sketch a picture of the Teutonic Order for you. If the Knights Templar were like a sophisticated, diplomatically smooth, deep-pocketed multinational corporation, the Teutonic Knights were German-born slaughter machines, rigid, extremely insular, and possessing an intense passion for territorial expansion by bashing heathens over the head with spiked maces, beautifully termed conversion. They were austere, they were efficient, and they ruled with an order in a way that would probably make even the devil shudder. Yet, even these cold-blooded war machines had a habit of keeping records. And even they, men who essentially lacked a fear nerve began to notice something off. Hidden deep within their suffocating correspondence, people began to find anomalies, scratches in the perfect historical picture, letters, codes, whispered warnings. They mentioned a group of outsiders, dark silhouettes that were completely absent from any operational plans, maps, or booty-sharing treaties. The Teutonic Knights called them by a name both reverent and full of vigilance: Fratres Flammae, the Brothers of the Flame. We have encountered them again, the black-clad knights, not belonging to us, not belonging to Rome. They carry no banners, but we know their purpose. They do not interfere. They only observe. Those lines are extracted from a letter dated 1342, sent by a garrison commander near Dorpat to the Grand Master of the Order at Marienburg. Close your eyes and imagine the scene. You are a weather-beaten Teutonic warrior, patrolling amidst the blank white snow. Suddenly, at the edge of the forest, giant black silhouettes on horseback appear. They have no insignia. Their swords and spears gleam but remain undrawn. They just stand there motionless, cold eyes tracking your every move. That's a chilling detail, isn't it? Their silence is more terrifying than 10,000 battle cries, and it bears an astonishing consistency. Throughout the next 2 decades, at least 7 letters from different notorious Teutonic strongholds reported these mysterious figures. They were always described with 3 characteristics: armed to the teeth, quiet as graves. And notably, they seemed to know Teutonic rituals like the back of their hands. They even anticipated supply routes and patrol schedules. Yet, when reported upward, no one, from bishop to grand master to royalty, stepped forward to claim authority over this group of knights. Not a soul. They existed outside the margins of the system, always cloaked in black, and always observing. But it didn't stop there. Another letter pushed this mystery even further. The letter was written in a cipher so complex that it wasn't until the 19th century that experts managed to decode it. It describes a direct encounter between a Teutonic knight and a man he called by the title, the Bearer of the Buried Flame. This Bearer of the Flame presented a seal, the shape of a red cross nestled squarely inside a black circle. Sound familiar? If you've ever studied Templar history, it will give you goosebumps, because it is identical to the seals excavated from the ruins of the Knights Templar in the Vosges and the La Rochelle region of France before the Great Purge. The Teutonic knight tremblingly wrote back, "He spoke very little, but Agaze knew far too much. He asked for no favors, only requested that we do not light fires on the old land ever again." The old land. What on earth was he implying? I, Zorro, have read dozens of theories. Some researchers believe those were sacred pre-Christian lands, or Gnostic sites that the Knights Templar in their golden age had secretly protected. Others, more practical, think it was a metaphorical threat. Don't be foolish enough to reignite ancient wars. But whichever way you interpret it, the plain truth here is, the Black Templars, or whatever entity they were evolving into, possessed a massive amount of knowledge regarding the Eastern Front. A sharp and vast knowledge far exceeding anything a bunch of exiled warriors fleeing France could hold. And then we must speak of the fire. In the dark, fire is usually meant to consume. But to them, fire was a symbol of preservation. Texts called them custodes ignis, the guardians of the fire. Another letter, written in a hybrid of Latin and Low German, used a phrase that, every time it's mentioned, strikes me with a poetic irony. Flamma sine fumo, flame without smoke. Its implication is full of the colors of mystical alchemy, a flame that burns but does not corrode matter, a light that illuminates the path but does not blind the eyes of the beholder. It reminds me of an ancient motto, ex tenebris lux. Out of darkness, light shines forth. Except, in these Livonian marshlands, that light was not the divine light radiating from the heavens above. It was controlled, sealed, like a torch paraded by invisible hands from one century to the next, never fully extinguished, yet never permitted to be brought into the sunlight. And amidst the tangled mess of those encrypted letters, we stumble upon the craziest artifact, the Livonia map. Currently housed in the National Library of Estonia, this map was drawn with crude charcoal and ink that has faded since the late 14th century. It seems to have been an internal document, not meant for uninitiated eyes. But it contains two details that make historians scratch their heads raw. First, it depicts a trail piercing through forbidden forests. No towns, no fortresses. That trail is marked by 7 equally spaced seals, 7 circles enclosing 7 snakes, each looking back in a different direction. Not a single line of annotation, not an explanation, just 7 snakes guarding in stillness. Second, and the most valuable asset, at the very bottom corner of the map, there is a tiny drawing. A rider in a black cloak carrying a lantern in his hand. Beneath him are 3 words, Ille qui custodit, he who guards. The ridiculous thing is, this is absolutely not the language or style of the Teutonic Order. It is ancient, dark, and heavily redolent of the manuscripts hidden inside the cloaks of the Knights Templar, who stealthily fled Cyprus after the events of 1307. Why would a Templar symbol sit proudly on the campaign map of the Northern Crusaders? The only logical answer, my friends, the Black Templars were not fleeing like rats at all. They were watching the Watchers. They infiltrated these wild borderlands not to force baptisms on the populace. They observed. They sustained. They wove a massive intelligence network running covertly beneath the slaughtering boot heels of the crusade. Occasionally, that underlying tension exploded into wordless violence. Tales are told of a village near the Daugava River flattened in a single night, not the typical style of a rebellion. No fire leaping into the sky, no looted wealth. Everything simply collapsed. And right in the epicenter of the ruins, on a stone slab covered in ash, people found an inverted Templar cross carved into it. Surrounded by ash and debris, yet the slab itself remained completely pristine without a single scratch. A message left behind for the curious, or a bloody threat, or both. The world always glues its eyes to Jerusalem, to Rome, to the corrupt political intrigues of the French royal palace when mentioning the fall of the temple. They forgot Livonia, but that very oblivion made this place a perfect forge, a desolate, freezing tundra where an order thought to have been decapitated could silently regrow new fangs without a single eye in Paris spying on them. They did not come here to fight. And then, as the 14th century drew to a close, the Teutonic report letters also sank into permanent silence, as if the Black Ghosts had completed their mission and dissolved into the Baltic mist. But the name Brothers of the Flame did not die. It hibernated, only to resurface centuries later on the pages of a pamphlet printed by the Freemasons in Königsberg, with a line capable of haunting anyone seeking the truth. They came in stillness, bearing no names, and lit a fire that did not blaze. Some candles were simply never born to be snuffed out. Leave the bone-chillingly frozen marshlands of the north. Put on warm clothes, because we are moving to a place where the cold doesn't pierce the flesh, but snakes its way into the very soul. Welcome to 15th century Venice. What do you think Venice is? A romantic city with peaceful canals? Sorry to break your illusion. Venice at that time was a massive spiderweb woven with veils. Luxurious silk veils, brutal trade curtains, filthy political schemes, and choking with deadly secrets. It was a place where a wealthy merchant lord could stand shoulder to shoulder with hitmen spies who killed without blinking. A place where holy monasteries doubled as the most ruthless banks in Europe. And think about it, if you were a remnant organization being fiercely hunted across the entire continent, where is the best place to hide? Precisely where everyone is wearing a mask. If the Black Templars had survived the fire that turned Paris to ash and made it through the years of exile in Portugal, then the labyrinthine alleys and identity-shrouding rituals of Venice were the perfect sanctuary for them. And our clue, ironically, lies within the yellowed pages of a monk. In the dust-filled archives of San Giorgio Monastery, there is a diary by monk Julio Verani, a Dominican scholar with eyes sharp as a hawk for anomalies. The log entry dated March 7th, 1439, begins as blandly as any other day. A few comments on commodity prices, a grumble about the mossy, damp weather. But then his handwriting suddenly turns urgent, pressing deep into the parchment. A guest arrived tonight, attired in the style of the Holy Land, yet not an Easterner, neither young nor old, eyes like parchment soaked in ink. He claimed no titles, no lineage, yet everyone knelt when he entered. Eyes like parchment soaked in ink. Do you shudder visualizing that gaze? Deep black, containing countless stories, yet revealing absolutely nothing. That man didn't bother to state his name. Julio only tremblingly called him by a moniker, Il Cavaliere delle Due Età, the Knight of Two Eras. This uninvited guest stayed at the monastery for 3 nights. He was silent as a boulder and flatly refused confession, an act bordering on heresy at the time. Instead of kneeling before God, he locked himself in the library. He didn't take notes, nor did he bother to skim standard liturgical texts. His gloved fingers only flipped open books that even the most learned monks dared not touch. Treatises on ancient sacred geometry, obscure Gnostic hymns reeking of heresy, and notably, a strictly sealed copy of the book Liber de Figura, an absolutely forbidden manuscript delineating in detail the symbolic architecture of orders rejected by the throne of St. Peter. Through each page of the diary, Giulio's curiosity gradually shifted into extreme unease. On the second night, he stalked and recorded a ghostly scene. He prays without blinking his lips. The candles do not flicker at all in his cell. A ring on his hand bears the shape of a double cross, not one stacked upon the other, but one nested hidden behind the other. A sign I have seen exactly once before in the ruins of Acre. Pause here for a beat. The city of Acre, the final stronghold of the Crusaders, had collapsed in flames over a century prior. More than 100 years. That double-cross symbol only survived as faint graffiti on ruins and margins of discarded maps. Yet now it sits proudly on the finger of a man who walks with an air as if the ashes of the Battle of Acre still linger on his shoulders. The morning the knight departed, fog rose thick from the lagoon, swallowing the stone corridors. Giulio secretly tracked him to the eastern cloister. There, obscured in the milky white mist, 3 men stood waiting. All wore black cloaks, their faces hidden by the shadow of their hoods. The knight turned back, looking at Giulio one single time, a look without blinking, not a word of farewell. Then he walked away, and all 4 ghosts dissolved into the Venetian mist as if they had never existed. No names, no destination. The only thing proving they had just stood there was a faint trace left upon the mossy, waterlogged stone slab. Not the boot print of a knight, it was the seal of something far more ancient. A 7-pointed star, gently imprinted into the green moss. You have surely heard me, Zorro, mention the echoes of this star before. In Portugal, in the kingdom of Castile, on the forgotten blood-stained altars of the Vosges region. But here in the heart of Venice, its meaning has transformed. It is no longer the trace of fugitives. It is the symbol of ultimate authority. Years later, in a secret letter to a colleague in Avignon, Giulio proposed a bold hypothesis. That man was not a knight. He was a master. A human being or a title, capable of stepping through the destruction of centuries as smoothly as walking through a cloud of smoke. The glittering title of Grand Master when Grand Master was never uttered, but an apparatus like the temple requires a commanding brain. If the Black Templars truly existed and operated in the shadows, they were bound to elect a leader. But this leader did not lead troops into battle under the Pope's banner. He didn't serve the foolish whims of kings. He existed to maintain the flame, to keep legitimacy from rotting, to protect an invisible treasure, memory. This anonymity was even systematized. A Masonic document from the early 1600s, dug out from the ruins of a printing house in Venice, contains an encoded diagram titled Lumen Ex Persona, light emanating from the person. The central drawing is a cloaked, faceless figure holding a solitary key, surrounded by 12 symbols representing the 12 regions of Europe. Beneath the margin of the page is a line mocking all earthly power. He who proclaims his own name is not the true one. Contempt for empty titles became embedded in their DNA. Later records scattered across Europe when mentioning similar figures, always male, always in dark cloaks, always bearing a timeless beauty, neither old nor young, all called them by humble names. Custodes, the guardians, or simply the listeners. They didn't rule by breathing fire. They ruled by presence. Imagine them like a torch at the eye of a blizzard, not screaming, not commanding, merely standing there and shining so that those who have lost their way know where to go. Even in a pragmatic place like Venice, these figures entered the realm of myth. The gondoliers, the city's greatest gossips, often whispered to one another during drunken nights about a strange man who always appeared and walked across the bridges on the exact nights of blood-red lunar eclipses. Always solitary, always silent. Children in the alleys even sang creepy nursery rhymes about the knight who understands your dreams. Most intellectuals smirked and dismissed it as cheap folklore, until a flesh and blood truth dropped out of the archives. In 1492, Yes, the exact year Columbus was painstakingly preparing to weigh anchor across the Atlantic. A personal accounting ledger of the Scuola di San Marco recorded a bizarre expense, slapping skeptics right in the face. The books explicitly state supply of silk, premium black, tailored for a foreign guest. But in the payment column it reads, exempt from payment, blessing received. That guest, of course, left no name behind, but the meticulous accountant of the Scuola, perhaps overly impressed, drew an image of the ring the man wore on his hand. The drawing is plain as day on the edge of the paper. A cross nestled squarely inside a lunar eclipse. Always the same throughout the centuries. And so, the most fascinating question now is no longer, did such a man exist? The real question must be, does he still exist out there, right at this moment? A grand master who doesn't seek power, but only remembers. A defense system built not to protect gold, treasure, or the bone fragments of saints, but to protect an absolute silence. A colossal silence stretching thousands of miles, from the pyres of Paris to Lisbon, from the fortress of Tamar winding across the treacherous Alps, from the bloody battlefield of Acre retreating deep into the canals of Venice. That silence is not a muteness born of terror. It is designed intentionally, systematically, because the Black Templars fully understood that if they wanted to survive in a world where both kings and popes wanted to hack them to pieces, they needed much more than a few underground hideouts. They needed a completely new direction. The goal was not to reestablish an army. The goal was not to swing swords and slaughter to reclaim honor. The goal was survival. To weave their ultimate purpose across centuries, invisible to the eyes of the great powers. And so, my friend, it is highly possible that at this very moment as we speak, somewhere out there in the dense fog of history, a nameless man is still quietly walking. He carries no swords or spears. He carries memories, and that thing sometimes is sharper than 1,000 blades combined. In our day and age, a seal might just be a piece of plastic stamping a bright red mark onto a mess of tedious administrative paperwork. But in medieval Europe? Oh no, my friend. A seal was the voiceless language of absolute power. It wasn't just a finishing touch to look pretty. It was authority. A signature bearing the crushing weight of law, of faith, and of an entire empire. A single seal could order the execution of tens of thousands or grant amnesty to a demon. So, can you imagine the pale, sweat-drenched faces of the 15th century inquisitors? That was when they began their searches and discovered documents sealed with a type of wax, whose origin they were completely unable to trace. These seals were dark, crude, bearing a bizarre symbolism that lay outside all standards of royal or ecclesiastical heraldry. Warning bells rang out continuously within the corridors of power. But of course, they only rang quietly, because this sigil didn't scream an arrogant challenge in their faces. It was a deliberate concealment that, ironically, terrified the hunters even more. The first incident occurred in Rouen. The authorities confiscated a sealed chest from a merchant suspected of trafficking forbidden relics, a rather lucrative trade at the time. When they pried open the lid, what they found inside was not the skull of some saint, but contracts, mind-boggling encrypted letters, and a small book wrapped in animal hide. There wasn't a single signature. But among the yellowed pages were countless whispered references to the Brothers of Silence. And the seal affixed to the book's cover? It didn't bear the red of power, nor the gold of royalty. It was black, a black as thick as a moonless night. On the wax surface was the faint imprint of the Templar cross, imprisoned inside a coiled snake. That's not all. The most gruesome part lay in the ink used in those ledgers. The ink color was rusty, turning to a murky brown. Later analysis exposed a shocking truth. That ink was blended from iron filings and fresh blood. At first, the Inquisitors tried to reassure themselves. They shrugged it off as a cheap hoax, or worse, a psychological warfare tactic from the underworld designed to taunt the church. But then, other pieces of the puzzle began to fall out of the darkness. In Avignon, a jackpot aristocratic family was thrown into the interrogation room for holding shady gatherings in their private chapel at midnight. The servants, panicking and trembling, testified that they saw tall men, cloaked in dark garments, quietly entering without anyone announcing their names. Their hands were completely gloved and their eyes were obscured by hoods. These ghosts stayed there for hours, then left the way they came, leaving behind on the altar only a scroll sealed in wax. The lady of the house wept persistently, claiming it was just an innocent prayer. But guess what? The seal matched perfectly. Black wax, circular. A cross nestled neatly inside the coiled snake. The panic spread all the way to the top-secret archives of the Vatican. In a damp corner reserved for the Catalogus Ordinum Nonconformium, Catalog of Nonconforming Orders, a scribbled note was found in the margin. Seal recovered near Lyon, 1441. Stamped with the same symbol found in document 14, Q Obscura. Black wax, likely linked to an exterminated order. Further analysis forbidden. Further analysis forbidden. Do you smell the scent of cowardice? The Church, the most powerful entity in Europe at the time, chose to turn a blind eye and a deaf ear, because the implications behind that seal were far too terrifying. If this sigil was real, it meant that decades after the Templars were officially slaughtered and uprooted, a network of remnants was still stretching its octopus tentacles across France, Italy, and the Rhine Valley. They operated smoothly, using a secret set of communication rules, leaving absolutely no clues of names for the executioners. Only black wax and symbols. The deeper we dig down this rabbit hole, the more bizarre things become. Take a look at a commercial ledger found in Bruges. The ledger lists a series of trade transactions under a single acronym, MRS. These transactions occurred continuously, like clockwork, from 1433 to 1447. They shared a common trait: always paid in full, upfront in cash, always requiring transportation for people referred to as sworn pilgrims. A crumpled receipt records the delivery of a shipment of iron tools used for sacred purposes. Accompanying it was a hurried sketch of that very same black wax seal. It wasn't drawn for decoration, but as an identification tool, a form of password to confirm identity. But what sent shivers down my spine was the merchant's accompanying note. They insisted that it must be burned upon receipt, not broken, but burned. Think about that. Breaking a seal is to open a letter, but burning a seal to ashes, that is a ritualistic act, a purification by fire, or simply iron discipline to destroy evidence without a trace. This behavior isn't something you learn from merchants who calculate every single coin. It's the cold military discipline of orders that value blood rituals more than life itself. And then the gears of history bring us to a tiny, forgotten chapel in a village in northern Burgundy, which has now been swallowed by thorny vines. During a restoration effort in the late 1990s, masons accidentally broke through the stone floor and discovered a box hidden beneath the main altar. Inside was a piece of parchment so decayed that not a single letter could be read, but lying next to it, perfectly preserved in the cold of the stone boulders, was a wax seal. Still that same gloomy black. But this seal had evolved. Right in the center of the familiar cross and coiled snake, a new symbol had been intricately carved into the wax face. A tiny flame. This flame did not blaze proudly. It was safely enclosed within the snake's circle, as if protected from the toxic winds of time, as if being patiently guarded by someone. If you know how to look through the fog of history, you will see this flame appearing everywhere. In the jagged frescoes of a ruined Templar chapel near Toulouse, the tail of a snake tightly coiled around the base of a cross, and right at its central intersection sits a candle. In a tattered fragment of a Gnostic document pulled out of Geneva, the phrase lux in obscura circumdata, light enclosed by darkness, sits proudly right beneath a stylized seven-pointed star. It seems that to them the flame was not a tool to burn enemies or avenge the brothers who died in the fires of Paris. The flame was a metaphor for memory, not triumph, but enduring persistence. And if there is one word to describe the Black Templars right now, it is patience. The infinite patience of boulders. Even the nature of the seal itself, the gruesome blend of blood and wax, screams symbolism. It wasn't merely an intelligent security measure, it was sacrifice, a steel echo of underground oath ceremonies. It was the physical evidence of a brand new oath that had replaced the old standard of the temple. They no longer swung swords to bathe in blood under the sunlight. Now, their mission was to hide, observe, preserve, and continue to cherish something that had been forbidden by the world, but never forgotten by them. In 1621, during a bloody purge targeting secret societies conducted by the Habsburg royal family, a Masonic lodge in Prague was raided. The mercenaries ransacked everything, but only found a handful of innocuous documents. However, sitting lonely on the table was a single scrap of parchment. The front was completely blank. The back was stamped with a hair-raising black wax seal. There wasn't a single stroke of handwriting. No note of origin. Not addressed to anyone. Only that mark sat entirely alone. The inquisitors confiscated and kept it, perhaps with the foolish pride of those who had just won. It is suspected that those inquisitors completely failed to understand what they held in their hands, because that sigil was not a secret order calling to take up arms in rebellion. It was a contemptuous smirk, an eternal message sent to those who have eyes to read it. We are still here. That amid the dense dust of rusted relics and collapsed strongholds, their true legacy was never chests of gold. Their legacy was silence, rituals, memories carefully packaged in blood and wax. I, Zorro, must tell you this. In this world, you can easily burn a flag. You can use power to erase a name from every page of history. But you, and even the greatest of ruling powers, can absolutely never break the seal of something that from the very beginning was never opened. Hold on. Don't rush to think of cheap cliché black magic from comic books or guys in cloaks muttering incantations under a full moon. I, Zorro, am talking about something far more sophisticated and dangerous than that. Rituals, symbols, a lens for viewing the world powerful enough to strangle the throats of both church and crown. And when the temple collapsed, this treasury of knowledge did not evaporate in the hands of the Black Templars. It penetrated deeper underground, taking root and becoming far more insidious. Let's talk about alchemy. Alchemy was never truly about boiling a bunch of rusted metal into pure gold. Sorry if I just poured a bucket of cold water over your dreams of getting rich. That was just a smokescreen theory, a spectacular trick to distract greedy eyes. Real alchemy is a brutal process of transformation, transforming matter, transforming the soul, and transforming the very structure of power. Conjuring lead into gold is merely a naive metaphor for a greater mystery. Transforming darkness into light, casting off ignorance to reach absolute understanding. And on the tattered margins of history, the Black Templars seem to be masters of this language. How do I know? Flip through the Gospel of the Furnace, a manuscript that popped up dynamically in the 17th century and then vanished without a trace, written in Latin and Occitan, with no author, no sect. Its rough parchment pages frantically describe a black flame paraded by those who had once tasted the stench of swords and spears, and now immersed themselves in the stillness of the grave. It babbles about 7 inverted seals, the stone inside the fire, and the oath of the unbroken vessel. Pretentious scholars immediately threw it into the trash, calling it Rosicrucian delusion. They always smirked, until the event at Gisors broke out. Gisors, the massive fortress that has long reeked of suspicion as the hiding place of the final Templar treasure. In a tightly sealed cellar beneath the chapel floor, what did they dig up? Gold? No, they found heretical ceremonial tools, a chalice, a cold iron compass, a bowl encrusted with mercury residue, and hitting your eyes directly on the stone boulder wall was a massive fresco, Ouroboros, the bizarre snake devouring its own tail, coiled around a flame, a black flame, unlit, sealed within a layer of pigment even older than the mortar of the wall. You see, the church has long foamed at the mouth, accusing the Templars of heresy, spitting on the cross, locking lips with one another, worshiping the demon head Baphomet. 90% of that was garbage script, written out of the political motives of the King of France. But within that pile of manure accusations, there was still a seed of truth, a seed that gave popes sleepless nights. The Knights Templar were indeed infected by Eastern thought when they occupied Jerusalem, Antioch, and Acre. They translated Arabic magical texts, exchanged secrets with Sufi mystics, and sat at the same table with Jewish Kabbalists. They didn't just plunder gold and silver, they plundered symbols, ideas, and perhaps paths of salvation that didn't go through Rome. There is one thing that constantly haunts heretical records from the 14th and 15th centuries. Ignis Niger, the Black Flame. A flame that burns but is freezing cold. A light that emits no warmth at all. Leading scholars believe this is the greatest metaphor for hidden wisdom. A light that only opens the path for those who dare to embrace ultimate contradiction. Fire, yet not fire. Light, yet invisible to the naked eye. Knowledge, yet a kind of knowledge that can slit your throat. Among the relics left behind by the Black Templars, the most gruesome have to be the iron lanterns, Forget about the glittering gilded chests containing the finger bones of Catholic saints. These lanterns were blocks of pitch-black iron, heavy, rustic, and completely devoid of air vents for a candle. So, what did they contain? At the Convent of Christ in Portugal, they pried open a secret chamber and found one. Inside, it contained no light. It contained an opaque piece of obsidian stone and a hollow chamber lined with reflective metal. According to all laws of physics and spirituality, it was a vessel of darkness, a tool to trap shadows. What was its purpose? No one dares to assert. But I have a theory that will make your skin crawl. These lanterns were paraded in midnight rituals, not to illuminate the world, but to obscure it. A ruthless reminder that not all truth can be seen, that to understand certain secrets of the universe, you are forced to become blind. The core of this darkness is transformation itself. The Black Templars had lost everything: lands, titles, castles. They could no longer scream for crusades or issue orders to kings. The only thing they could do was preserve, transforming the bloody power of the sword into a new kind of flame. Hidden, portable, deathless. The term vas negredo, vessel of blackness, appears densely in encrypted letters from the Alps. In alchemy, that is the stage of decomposition, the rotting of the old self to begin a new form. But in the documents of the Black Temple, vas negredo is always capitalized. It is not a process. It is a title. In fact, it is a person. Could it be the nameless Grand Master, or the moniker for any recruit who dares to drape themselves in the mute black cloak? Even the enemy could smell this danger. An anonymous cardinal, in a panicked letter stuck at the Vatican registry, tremblingly wrote of a doctrine concealed in thick smoke, preserved by those who never kneel before any altar. The old man was terrified, not because he feared a mutiny, but because he feared a replacement. That the Black Templars didn't bother to build an army. They were building a philosophy, an ideology forged to outlast thrones, outlive the rotting papal decrees, and smolder in places where God's light is never welcomed. Because the black flame was not born to illuminate this world, but to survive its destruction. And now, pull up your collar. I am going to take you to the final stop of this journey. Prague, December 21st, 1421. A letter without a seal, folded sharply into 4 parts, wrapped in fine vellum, was quietly slipped through the door slit of an astronomy professor in the old town. The contents were merely a date and a place where the stars meet the stone slab. To common fools, it was garbage. But to the professor, a man with links to underground organizations, it was an invitation ticket from hell. In his personal diary, hidden at the bottom of a drawer in the Clementinum library, the professor left a testimony of what he called the quietest gathering I have ever witnessed, and the moment I felt most awake. That night, a blizzard tore through the Prague sky. Covered heavily, he trudged toward the abandoned round structure of St. Longinus, a pitch-black Romanesque ruin that even locals didn't bother to glance at. Inside, there was no cheap drama, no groaning chants, no thick incense smoke, no throne, and no fresh blood. Only 15 men, giants, wearing black cloaks, their faces entirely consumed by darkness. They stood in a deadly circle surrounding an iron lantern, which, of course, did not emit a single ray of light. They all wore gloves to conceal the rings of power on their fingers. Their silence was not confusion, it was a sharp weapon. The professor swore that every breath in that room was calculated. Even the smallest gesture was a piece of code. Lying abandoned on the cold stone floor at the center of the circle was a map, hand-drawn with rusty ink. It was riddled with grotesque lines. A compass rose with no letters, stars bent into unnatural configurations, and an inverted cross pinned straight into a sun with 7 rays of light. The connecting lines twisted and broke, following no geographical laws, but running along mysterious ley energy lines, or perhaps running along the veins of forgotten memories. No one bothered to utter a single word to the invited guest. No one introduced themselves. But then, at the easternmost point of the circle, a towering man stepped forward. He firmly held a scepter wrapped with a spiral iron ribbon. The man pointed the scepter at a spot on the map, then slowly raised his hand, placing it firmly against his left chest, right over the beating of his heart. Not a sound was made, only the brutal act of determination. That was the voiceless language honed through the blood pools of centuries, understood only by beings who had witnessed empires crumble with their own eyes and absolutely refused to speak of them. Outside that ruined fortress, Prague was sinking into a deep sleep. Not a single drunkard or sentry knew that, right beneath their cold paving stones and glittering gilded altars, something older and darker than this world was still breathing. They gathered not to overthrow the world of light. They gathered to continue their own darkness. People still praise Prague as a city of magical thresholds, of alchemists and revolutionaries. But the truth, my listening friends, is that history is not written on sunny squares. True history, the darkest, most ruthless, and most enduring kind, is always passed from hand to hand in stillness, traversing underground networks by those who never seek for the world to remember their names. Today, we peel away the mask of history to talk about silence, about those whose very existence is a slap in the face to mainstream historians, the Black Templars. If these ghosts had truly gathered together beneath the European sky, I bet you they didn't come to raise flags or beat drums. They didn't need applause. They did it to confirm, to whisper in each other's ears, we are still here, and we have not forgotten. Some modern scholars, those who always lock themselves inside safe ivory towers, always try to scoff and dismiss this record. They say it's just a fabrication, the delirium of someone who sank too deep into the mystical world. But do you know what's ridiculous? The place alleged to be their rendezvous point, a fortified domed building, suddenly turned to ash in a fire in 1422. That moment took place a mere 6 weeks after the rumored gathering. What did the official records of the authorities back then blame it on? Do you know? A lightning strike. Brilliant. Lightning striking on a night when the sky was clear without a single trace of a storm cloud. Do you smell the savor of a clumsy play? What was left of that structure wasn't just torn down. It was obliterated, ruthlessly leveled in less than a year. Not a single foundation stone was allowed to be reused. That plot of land was sealed, left cold and abandoned like a hideous scar in the heart of the city until the 19th century when they tried to build a stupid post office over it. And then, guess what? That structure also quickly collapsed into ruins right during its construction process. Sometimes the earth refuses to hide the secrets that blood and fire have created. You might say, Zorro, are you telling ghost stories? That's just legend. Agreed. Legends are always ridiculous. But legends cannot write parchment scrolls with their own hands. In 1994 in Prague, a restoration expert was working on the ceiling of the Clementinum Library. In that space filled with the scent of the dust of time, among the rotting wooden beams, he found a hollow cavity. Inside was a bundle of papers that had slept for centuries. On those pages there was no poetry or teachings of God. They were star maps, weird geometric diagrams, and a page marked with a line in Latin, cold and sharp, as if stabbing into the reader's eyes. Ordinum non conformis iterum convocati. The non-conforming order is summoned again. In the corner of that page was a symbol that mystery hunters today are all too familiar with. A black cross, a coiled snake, and a flame. What did they meet for? To plot the overthrow of popes? No. You underestimate them far too much. I, Zorro, am telling you. Their behavior is what sends chills down spines. They didn't map out bloody strategies. They didn't divide lands. They were synchronizing, just like how you connect a massive network. They cross-referenced maps, signs, memories, to ensure that these rotting remnants scattered across Europe still beat with the same dark pulse. There is something incredibly sacred, yet twisted here. It doesn't lie in conquest, but in preservation, a kind of oath that goes far beyond any writing ink. The professor who once laid hands on those documents called them a mirror reflecting time itself. Although he never saw those people again, the final diary entry he left behind remains haunting to this day. They do not seek to rule. They do not seek to win. They only seek to remember what the world rejects. You see, some tyrants draw empire maps with ink and blood. But these ghosts, they draw it with silence. Follow me to Ravenna, Italy. Beneath the dusty nooks of a library, there is a faded 15th century sheepskin map. But if you are a navigator, this map will take you straight to hell. It doesn't sketch the Mediterranean with familiar coastlines or harbors. Not at all. It displays the world through symbols, stars, deadly spirals, and a network of intersecting circles. No compass, no legend. And right at its center, where the brilliant Holy Land of Jerusalem should have been placed, is a single black flame. In the bottommost corner, a line of small text reads, Custodes Lucis Vetustae, the guardians of ancient light. The origin of this cursed object once drove historians mad, until they tracked down an inventory slip tucked inside a document file of the same era. The handwriting on it exposed the author. It matched perfectly with the handwriting of a scribe belonging to the Order of Christ, the organization considered to be the smokescreen covering the survival of the temple in Portugal. The note was simple, but enough to make you shudder. Delivered by the Knights of Twilight, preserved for the next crossing. The next crossing. For a long time, people have whispered that the Black Templars did not just tightly clutch moldy relics or religious privileges. What they were truly transporting were maps. Drawings that were never approved by royalty or the church. They weren't nautical charts used for commerce. They were fragments of a hidden geographical system, representing what history dares not acknowledge. But this map was only the beginning of a far more bone-chilling secret network. What do you think the Inquisition feared most? Witches riding broomsticks? Smooth-talking smugglers? No. What made the fat dignitaries of the church break out in a cold sweat, ironically, was the blank spaces. In 1482, in Florence, a navigator named Tommaso Malaspina was dragged by the papal authorities into a dungeon. The charge? Possessing documents contrary to faith and doctrine. It sounds grand, but in reality, among his confiscated belongings were only 2 scrolls of parchment, which have now conveniently evaporated from history, and a leather-bound folder. Inside that folder was a fragment of a map depicting the coast of North Africa. But oh, how grotesque this map was. It ignored everything that a normal map should have. No large, bustling cities, no clear borders dividing territories. And strangest, most gruesome of all, it depicted an empty, endless ocean, marked only by 3 cold Latin words. Hic non est finis. Here is not the end. According to the bloody interrogation records of the Inquisition, Malaspina testified that the map was not drawn by him. It was handed to him by an unknown knight, one who bore the mark of the sleeping cross. That knight told the navigator a line that I bet made the bishop's hearts skip a beat. This map is not for steering ships. It is for guiding the mind. It represents the world behind the world. The world behind the world, an all too dangerous concept. Naturally, the Inquisition reacted the only way they knew how, calling it heresy. Malaspina vanished forever into the darkness. No one ever saw him again. But you cannot lock up a ghost, and you especially cannot burn a decentralized encryption system. Fragments of that same grotesque symbolic system began to leak across Europe. They snaked into the carvings of remote chapels, crept onto the illuminated margins of Bibles, and even sat proudly on the margins of dusty alchemical treatises. Malaspina's map was not an isolated artifact. It was a piece of code. It didn't belong to any specific individual or lodge. It belonged to an invisible network. The Guardians, the Transporters. In the crumpled letters of 15th century merchants, one finds whispers about such figures. Travelers dressed entirely in black. They caught late ships without warning, never carrying merchandise, spices, or silk. What they wanted to exchange was information. Imagine this scene. A man in a black cloak walks into an inn, tosses a bag of silver onto the table, or promises some mysterious service. He doesn't ask for fine wine or women. He only requests one thing: access to bell towers, lighthouses, observatories, towering places, places where the stars can be clearly seen. A Sicilian notary once recorded meeting a strange man. That person didn't bother to mark crowded cities on his map, but focused only on tracing invisible alignments. He didn't ask about the tides to set sail, but asked about solar and lunar eclipses instead. You can scoff and dismiss it, thinking it was just the cheap superstition of the Middle Ages, but just wait. The year 2009. Fairly close to us, isn't it? At the magnificent Château de Chambord in France, an archivist pried open a false bottom of a 16th century globe. Inside, folded neatly and sleeping for centuries, was a piece of parchment. It bore a fragment of that exact same heretical mapping style, and right on the bottom margin, like a proud signature defying time, the coiled cross, a faded but unmistakable black seal. What on earth were they doing? I, Zorro, dare assure you that if this was a campaign, it was entirely non-military. It was a philosophical war. The Black Templars, or whatever damn organization sprouted from their silence, were not trying to redraw borders. They were preserving knowledge that had lost its footing in this narrow world. Knowledge that perhaps once shone brilliantly at the Library of Alexandria, hid beneath the sands of Petra, or echoed in Solomon's temple, or, more simply, knowledge of the spaces that lie in between. Buy a plane ticket to Portugal, step into the convent of Christ in Tamar. Look at one of the pillars inside. There's a strange carving that for hundreds of years people have foolishly believed to be just decoration. It depicts a circle cut by 7 straight lines, each ending in a star. Recently, when applying modern analysis, people's jaws dropped to realize these 7 stars perfectly match the locations of 7 monasteries across Europe that once had close links to the Templar order. When you plot these 7 points on a map and connect them, boom, it doesn't form a cross. It doesn't form a cliché devil's pentagram. It forms a spiral. A spiral doesn't mark a destination. It marks a movement. The map guardians were not navigators in the way history defines it. They despised territory. What they worshipped was connection, resonance. They tried to keep ancient paths humanity had forgotten or been forced to forget, from being completely obliterated. And do you know what the most ironic, most poetic thing in this entire story is? In a world increasingly bound, suffocated by straight borders, colorful flags, and ruthless cannon barrels, these men dressed in black quietly carried the curves. The year 1911, outskirts of Frascati, Italy. At an abandoned Roman villa behind a ruined wall, restoration experts drilled through to a cellar. It wasn't very deep, no booby traps or gold chests waiting. There was only a single shelf carved straight into the rock, and sitting proudly on it was this thing, a small book, black, leather-bound, brittle and decaying. No title on the cover, no author's name on the spine daring to claim responsibility for what lay inside. The only thing marking its existence was a heated seal branded onto the cover, a cross nestled inside the mouth of a snake with its tail coiled into a spiral at the bottom. They called it the Roman Black Book. For over a century, scholars have bickered endlessly about it, but only dared to argue in closed rooms. Why? Because what is inside this book could rewrite history. The language inside is Latin, but not the melodious, smooth Latin of the church or hymns. It is blunt, formulaic, cold. It is the language of a military accountant. Yes, my friends, this demonic grimoire is actually nothing more than a ledger. But look at what it records. Names, places, payments. Only thing is, these transactions do not match any records of the Vatican, the Roman nobility, or the papal treasury. They were classified by symbols, the cross of Lorraine, a coiled snake, a crescent moon pierced through by a sword. Each page lists dry materials, iron, grain, wax, parchment, salt. But accompanying them are bone-chilling notes for the watch beneath the tower or in silence. And there is a phrase repeated with a haunting frequency: solutio pro tenebrae, payment for the darkness. The ledger begins recording from the year 1321, nearly a decade after the temple was officially destroyed by the Pope, and it stretches continuously all the way until 1512, 2 centuries, nearly 200 years recording the activities of a system, an organization, that the entire world assumed was burned to ash at the stake. These steady pen strokes, this iron-disciplined accounting style, could not be the product of a disorganized remnant group. Where did they operate? Tomar, Gizors, Rosslyn, the familiar names. But then there were Petra, Rhodes, Thessaloniki. Unless The order was never dissolved. They simply dispersed. And then there were lines hinting at alchemy. A sum of money for the maintenance of the furnace. The furnace in alchemy is not for cooking. It symbolizes transformation, the refinement of matter or the soul into a higher state. A record mentions Lord de Lannoy in 1349, whom historians suspect to be a descendant of the last Grand Master, Jacques de Molay. He was not called a knight, but was noted with titles that give people goosebumps. The map bearer, the unburned one, the executor of silence. The Vatican denies all involvement. Of course, the Vatican always denies everything. But in the 1980s, an Italian collector acquired a single leaf, a fragment torn from this book. On it was written just a single line: Nigrum est lumen, quod non fallit. The black light does not deceive. It doesn't preach. It only records the silence. And the final page, dated 1512, is a blank page. No summary, no blessing. Just a waiting void. So, from 1512, where did these ghosts go? If Europe no longer contained them, where would they hide that no one would dare to look? The answer, my dear friend, is history's most ironic slap. They walked straight into the heart of their own mortal enemy. Open up the records of the Ottoman Empire. In the archives of the Topkapi Palace, people found strange field reports from 16th century Janissary commanders. What did they report on? On irregular European cavalry units, heavily armed, moving in small groups along the border. They popped in and out dynamically in raids, leaving no trace. They wore black from head to toe. Their faces were completely covered, and absolutely not a single one carried a banner. In 1504, in the Dinaric Alps, a Turkish patrol clashed with this group, mistaking them for bandits. But during the combat, a wounded Janissary reported that he heard them roar in Latin, "Nulla retro est." There is no backward path. Ottoman chroniclers called them by a highly paradoxical name, Kara Hatzlilar, the Black Crusaders. Do you see the laughably absurd irony here? A crusader who supports no church, a knight who kneels before no king. They didn't fight to expand territory. In fact, they fought against both sides. An Ottoman official in Anatolia wrote about them like this: "They are not Franks, nor slaves. They talk to no one. But the villagers say they have been here since another fiery era. They will appear when the old boundary lines are changed." But the most hair-raising evidence comes from the diary of Carlo Orsini, a Venetian diplomat who accidentally traveled through Ottoman territory in 1511. Near Smyrna, he encountered a band of black-clad horsemen camped beneath the ruins of a fortress. When one of them spotted the signet ring on Orsini's hand, the man approached and whispered into his ear in a cold voice, "The temple is not dead. It merely rotates." Orsini was so terrified that he fled headlong from the area that very night. Why did the Ottomans, a brutal empire, tolerate these Christian ghosts? Pragmatism, practicality, my friend. In a world where European kings had stabbed the temple in the back and the Pope had tossed them into the fire, it was precisely their former Muslim enemies, who couldn't care less about Vatican decrees, who brought them a sky of freedom. If you were an elite warrior group, ready to protect trade routes, provide intelligence, and care nothing for politics, you would be utilized by the Ottoman Empire. A 1522 document records that they assisted in evacuating civilians right in front of the Ottoman forces attacking Rhodes. There was only a brief line of a note left in the files. They arrived before the storm, they departed before the fire. Preserve, observe. Gatekeeping for memories, not for kingdoms. But after 1530, silence enveloped them once more. The records of the Kara Hatzlilar suddenly evaporated from Ottoman chronicles, as if they knew they were being watched. Or perhaps their purpose in this land was complete, and they moved on once again into the mist of history, waiting for another fire. Let's return to Europe. Dawn, October 4th, 1531. At a monastery nestled along the banks of the Tagus River in Lisbon, Portugal, a fire broke out in the lower quarters. The flames spread with a demonic speed, far too fast, according to the lucky survivors. Within just a few hours, the entire complex was turned into a pile of blackened stone and brick, smoldering and puffing smoke into the sky. And care to guess what the official reason recorded in the books was? Yes, a lightning strike. Once again, splendid. It seems God loves throwing lightning bolts at secret Templar facilities on nights when the sky is completely clear. Witnesses swore up and down that there wasn't a single storm cloud that day. This monastery, on paper, was just a tedious establishment, but behind those stone walls, it sat under the silent patronage of the Order of Christ, Portugal's phoenix born from the very ashes of the Templars. But hey, the fire wasn't the most terrifying thing. The terrifying thing is what evaporated after the fire. A cellar. A devilish cellar that didn't exist on any blueprint or registry of the monastery. It didn't lie beneath the sacred altar. It was buried deep underground, below the library, and you could only crawl down there via a spiral staircase that has now been obliterated. We know this thanks to a letter from an Augustinian monk named Pedro de Caldas, a letter discovered centuries later, awkwardly tucked inside a missal. Pedro wrote that the cellar didn't hide gold, silver, or relics. To the night watchman, gold is a cheap thing. Inside that cellar were pages, black flames, bizarre books that didn't bother with church-style binding, and scrolls containing maps, not used to map lands, but to map memories. And then Pedro mentioned a symbol engraved right at the entrance of the cellar. Listen carefully. A cross wrapped by a snake, topped with a circle with 7 points. Goosebumps yet? It matches perfectly, 100% with the seal in the Roman Black Book, with the lanterns in Portugal, and with the grotesque stones in the Vosges Mountains. But when Pedro returned after the fire, the cellar was empty, not burned to ashes. It had been cleared completely out. The timing of this fire reeks disgustingly. Just a few months prior, rumors were swirling across Portugal about a royal audit targeting the Order of Christ. Rome was beginning to pay attention. Whispers of ancient heresies, hiding under the guise of exploration, began to reach the Pope's ears. And the law? Boom! A lightning strike. Do you think that was an accident? No. It was a controlled purge, a ritualistic disappearance. The night before the fire, survivors recounted that strange guests knocked on the monastery's door. Men dressed in black cloaks, carrying no insignia whatsoever, claiming to be the auditors of the order. They moved with the precision of a killing machine. They only communicated in Latin, but not the muttering kind used by priests, rather a concise, razor-sharp legalistic tongue. They departed before sunrise. A few hours later, the fire erupted. 3 days later, at the port of Setúbal, a ship belonging to a Genoese merchant docked. The captain reported that he had received a private cargo shipment from a group of monks. Paid with what? With silver bars engraved with strange runes. The cargo manifest in the Genoa archives explicitly stated, "Sealed, slatted crates, opening forbidden, no recipient name." The ship weighed anchor under the cover of night, heading toward Funchal in Madeira. The last time it was seen was off the coast of the Azores. After that, no shipwreck was ever recorded. No debris washed ashore. Just a perfect disappearance. The cellar in Lisbon was never designed to last forever. It was merely a cocoon, a library born to be read only once, and then the map bearers moved on once more. So, where do they go when the world has no hiding places left? How do you hide the greatest secret in history? You don't bury it underground. You hide it within gestures. Everything always begins with a handshake, not the superficial, casual handshake between you and a colleague. It is a sequence of movements, fingers flexing at precise spots. The grip held back for a breath too long. A meaningless gesture to the uninitiated, yet everything to those who have been initiated. If the Black Templars truly vanished into the folds of history, then the handshake, the symbols, and the geometry are precisely where they left their final fingerprints. Inside Freemasonry. Do you think I'm spinning a cheap conspiracy theory? Look at the Sinclair parchment discovered in Edinburgh in 1742. Amidst tedious Masonic genealogies, a twisted image sits squarely. A hooded knight stands before a seven-spoke compass rose, surrounded by stars. One hand holds a mason's square. The other wields a sword pointed downward. He bears no Masonic crest, but across his chest is a small, dark cross enclosed in a coil. Go to Rennes-le Chapel in Scotland, a place that has always claimed to be the origin of the Masonic ritual. The walls there spit on Orthodox history, bizarre labyrinths, corn carved before the Americas were even discovered, musical cubes predating humanity's knowledge of musical notation. And deep within the crypt, hiding behind a pillar, is a sculpture of a snake coiled around a torch. But it isn't a blazing fire. It is a cold flame carved into the deathly pitch-black stone. In the York Rite of Freemasonry, there is a degree called the Order of the Temple. Initiates must undergo a trial that reenacts betrayal, burial, and resurrection. A chilling parody of the trial of Jacques de Molay. There are crestless mantles, broken swords, stone mirrors. They recite phrases dug straight out of the Roman Black Book and the letters in Livonia. Coincidence? Don't be so naive. In a yellowed personal letter from 1787, exchanged between two Masonic lodge masters in Frankfurt, a single line was found. A line enough to make you wonder whether the darkness looming out there is truly inanimate. That worshipful master wrote this: "The old night watchmen have not slept a wink." They are still present among us, not as masters, but as a memory. They handed us the maps, and we built the halls. Do you know what the most terrifying thing about whispers is? It's that you never know who started them. The anonymous letter carrying the above quotation arrived alongside a sketch. Not some nonsense treasure map from Hollywood movies, but a ring. A signet that, if you have followed me long enough into the hidden corners of history, will look spine-chillingly familiar. The coiled cross, the seven-pointed star, and a flame. Rewind time a bit, back to the stench of ashes and burning flesh. You might recall the Great Fire of Lisbon. Amidst that living hell, while people trampled over one another just to catch a breath of air, there were those who were busy with barrels. Tightly sealed oak barrels, quietly moved under the pitch-black night to coordinates that Orthodox history has permanently erased. What do you think was inside them? Gold and silver? Jewels? Oh, you are too naive. Gold is merely a toy for hollow kings. A few theorists, the rare ones who still keep a cool head, argue that those barrels contain things far more dangerous. Manuscripts, maps, measuring instruments, architectural blueprints, and even foundational texts with the power to overthrow any order. These dark seeds, centuries later, would be sown among the core ranks of an emerging power, Freemasonry. But they were not passed down intact. They were encoded. They were trimmed, edited, and camouflaged beneath countless layers of sophisticated metaphorical shells. Now, let me clarify one thing before your imagination flies too far. Is Freemasonry the Knights Templar reborn, donning business suits instead of chainmail armor? The harsh reality is, no. Those two cultures are separated by a vast chasm of time. Their purposes also veered in two entirely different directions. But history is never a series of broken straight lines. It consists of harsh echoes bouncing back across centuries. The question that truly gives us sleepless nights is this: was there some cold survival thread of the temple tightly stitched into the earliest, bloodiest rituals of Freemasonry? Not a dominating leadership. Not bloody conquests staining desert sands red, but something far more terrifying, an invisible influence. Don't believe me? Look at the visual evidence. It sits right before your eyes. Consider the suffocating presence of black cloaks in the highest level rituals of Freemasonry. Count the hauntingly repetitive occurrences of the number 7. 7 stars, 7 steps, 7 lamps illuminating secrets that cannot be named. And most importantly, consider the cult-like obsession with architecture as the ultimate sacred expression, with geometry revered as a divine language. Sound familiar? That's right. Those are precisely the concepts that took root with ruthless depth in the structures of the Knights Templar, stretching from the catacombs of Jerusalem to the fortress in Tomar. Let me take you to France in the 1600s. At a silent lodge, there is an intricately carved relief on cold stone. The stone carving depicts a knight standing alone by a window frame, his gaze fixed on the brilliant rising sun. But the strange part doesn't lie in the night. It lies on the windowsill. There, a scroll is unfurled, left blank. Not a single line of text, not an oath recorded. Only a single symbol sits proudly on the parchment page. The very symbol that now, when you close your eyes, you can picture. Its existence is not due to a miracle of time. It survived because it parasitized. It was transmitted through handshakes clenched tight in the dark, flared up on the stained glass windows of cathedrals, hid beneath intricate patterns on slippery floors, and culminated in the deadly silent moments of rituals, where even the speaker no longer remembers the roots of the words they are uttering. And my friend, that is the ultimate victory, the harshest irony of the Black Templars. Their victory did not lie in plundered chests of gold, nor in secret treasuries or massive fleets tearing across oceans. Their vicious greatness lay in their ability to encode themselves into the continuation of time. They did not choose to hide like rats in dark cellars. They did not chase soaring royal ambitions only to be decapitated. They hid themselves right inside secret societies, in subtle gestures, in ideologies whispered beneath flickering candlelight right before a bloody initiation ceremony begins. They are not Freemasons, yet their ghost dances right on the floor of the lodge, and soon enough, the patience of ghosts is always rewarded. Because revolutions, you see, never truly begin with rioting crowds holding pitchforks, screaming in the streets. They begin with whispers in closed rooms. Paris, 1789. Imagine a city blistering with rot. A massive powder keg piled high upon printing presses reeking of cheap ink, inside tea rooms buzzing with sedition, and inside the contracting, starving stomachs of tens of thousands of human beings. The old world order is cracking into large chunks. The monarchy is blinking in panic before a billowing, surging tidal wave. But if you can push the furious crowd aside, if you can see right through the guillotines preparing to taste blood and the hypocritical speeches reeking of fake human rights, you will spot the signs, faint, nearly invisible scratches showing that a far more ancient and ruthless current is beginning to stir in the deep. In the brief, suffocating weeks leading to the history-shaking storming of the Bastille, a thin, tattered book was frantically passed around the most squalid slums of Paris. The book bore no author's signature, printed on crude, cheap paper, but its title hit the viewer square in the eye with an ominous bluntness. De l'ordre caché, on the hidden order. The anonymous individual who wrote it spoke of an ancient brotherhood, a power once betrayed by cowardly kings, now being reborn out of absolute silence. Not a single line directly mentioned the name Knights Templar. But its words? Well, you cannot mistake the bite of a venomous snake. They were razor-sharp phrases, the broken flame, the oath in the dark, and a cold verdict. Justice is merely delayed, never denied. The gears of history have begun to mesh. Vengeance has been nurtured for nearly 500 years, and now the poisoned blade is slowly being drawn from its sheath. When the French Revolution erupted, the church, the power that once wielded scepters and breathed fire, now recoiled in a humiliating defensive stance. Monasteries were plundered down to the very last brick. The aristocracy crashed from power, either frantically fleeing for their lives or being dragged roughly through intersections packed with those who were starving and enraged. But push that noisy crowd aside. Follow the looters inside confiscated estates, especially those belonging to families long rumored to carry the bloodline of the Knights Templar. There, beneath layers of dust and false walls, they didn't find gold. They found bone-chilling artifacts, cold iron rings bearing black signets, yellowed scrolls carefully wrapped in hide covered in ash, an ash reminiscent of a fire snuffed out centuries ago. A revolutionary archivist, Claude Briand, stumbled upon something at the estate of the Marquis de Valcourt that sent a chill down his spine. It was a flag, black, its edges frayed and torn by time, but in the center was embroidered a faded red cross. Ironically, that cross did not sit neatly right in the middle. It tilted, like a mournful bowing of a head. Brian carefully transcribed it in his notebook. This does not match any crusade heraldry we have ever known. Accompanying the flag was a sealed letter, addressed to those bearing the alias, the Guardians of the Threshold. The content of that letter was never released to the public. However, Brian managed to note an excerpt, a prophecy that sounded like a hiss through clenched teeth. The temple will not rise in stone again. It rises in flame, in thought, in fracture. What fracture? The answer, laughably, lay within the final diary pages of Maximilien Robespierre, the chief architect of the Reign of Terror who sent thousands to the guillotine before losing his own head. After Robespierre was executed, people rummaged through his papers and found a mysterious entry, penned during sleepless nights just weeks before the guillotine began its bloodthirsty mechanical rotation. They visited me in silence, clad in black cloaks. No threats, no begging, only this: the sword has fallen once in Paris. Do not let it fall a second time in the dark. Mainstream historians, who always prefer everything to be neatly filed into logical drawers, scoffed and dismissed this. They called it a poetic metaphor, or worse, the paranoia of a mind crumbling under the pressure of power. But you and I, we know full well that Robespierre was not one given to paranoia. He was a cold-blooded and extremely precise calculating machine. The sword has fallen once in Paris. Do you recognize this brutal allusion? It is a chilling reminder of the bloody suppression of the Knights Templar in 1307, on the very same streets that were now preparing to bathe in new rains of blood. You might tell yourself, "Oh, Zorro, it's just a coincidence." Fine. Then let me throw another coincidence at you. Deep within the archives of the French National Assembly, there is a document that has never been brought to the light of official debate. It is an anonymous proposal submitted precisely during the early phase of the constitutional period. This document brazenly argues for the establishment of a secular brotherhood, unbound by the decaying dogmas of the Church, but bound together by memory. An invisible vanguard against the tyranny of both the old and new regimes. Attached to that document, yes, you guessed it, a sketch of a seal, a black cross tightly wrapped by a slithering snake and topped with a burning flame. The politicians of that era dismissed it as a persistent prank and tossed the paper into the fire. But that image had already managed to pin itself onto the retinas of the observant. As France sank into a bloodbath, amid the chaos of the Jacobins, Freemasonry, and the Illuminati, there was a group of people moving with the stillness of ghosts and the precision of a scalpel. Minor nobles desperately fleeing Paris tremblingly called them the Black Observers. They wore black, completely hooded, hats pulled down to conceal half their faces, popping in and out of damp dungeons or foul alleys. The Countess de Montaigne, one who luckily escaped the Grim Reaper's scythe, wrote from exile, her ink stroke still shaking. They came to my cell right before the rioting crowds broke down the door. They carried no weapons, only looked at me and uttered a single phrase: "You are not the one we seek." And then they dissolved into the darkness as if they had never existed. Who were they? Remnants of a forgotten Revolutionary Guard? Spies? No. If you meticulously connect the data points, a rule emerges that will send a chill down your spine. They only appeared near execution platforms. They were always intimately linked to the relics of the old church, of the old temple. And they always appeared right before the moment the guillotine blade slid down. Recall the smashed cellar in Lisbon in 1531, the parting words of Pedro de Caldas: "Memory is preserved until the next darkness." And that darkness was not a war grabbing for territory. It was a revolution overthrowing ideology. Because when kings lose their heads and sacred altars are smashed, old ideologies are reborn. Those guarding that conceptual flow have no need for armored armies or roaring cannons. They only need time to patiently hide, time to slide through the fractures of history, time to guide, to make certain that when the fire of revolution flares up, it burns exactly those who need to be consumed. There are even whispers among esoteric scholars, those who dare not disclose their true names, that the iconic Declaration of the Rights of Man of the French Revolution itself contains an underlying geometric structure borrowed directly from the architectural numerology of the temple, that the spiral of sacred values, liberty, equality, fraternity, is in fact a reproduction of the symbolic flame once passed from hand to hand in the dark by the Black Templars. Of course, there is no physical evidence stamped with a red seal for you to display in a museum. There is only rhythm, a haunting repetition, the quiet, persistent beat of a blood oath that has never been betrayed, an oath serving no national flag or church, but serving an ultimate concept, that power, when manipulated and abused, must absolutely be monitored. That memory, when erased by the victors, will be rewritten with the blood of revolutions. That is not history. That is a punishment. It is one of the darkest and most ridiculous ironies of history. Look at Nazi Germany's Third Reich, a regime that always beat its chest, boasting of supreme technological progress, of the so-called purity of the master race. Yet, behind armored tanks and inhumane laboratories, its inner ruling clique completely knelt blindly before the medieval past. They scoured the world to find the ruins of Atlantis, fanatically hunted the Spear of Destiny, and craved the Ark of the Covenant. But amid those countless mad ravings, there was an undercurrent colder than all else: the persistent, desperate hunt to find the Black Templars. Heinrich Himmler, the chief architect of the notorious SS and the self-proclaimed high priest of Nazi occultism. If you think he was just a ruthless desk-bound bureaucrat dressed in black, you are dead wrong. He deluded himself into thinking he was a modern-day knight, a spiritual warrior waging an esoteric war, hidden deep beneath the surface of political treaties and panzer divisions. Himmler transformed Wewelsburg Castle into the Grail fortress of the New Reich. He redesigned the place with hair-raising ceremonial rooms, ancient pagan symbols, and a central hall reserved exclusively for the supreme leaders, a farcical and fanatical imitation of King Arthur's legend, or perhaps derived from blueprints far older and darker than that. Deep within the archives of the Ahnenerbe, the Nazi Ancestral Heritage Research Institute, which specialized in legitimizing Himmler's delusions through pseudoscience, a series of top-secret field reports were found. Hounds of the SS had penetrated deep into southern France, northern Italy, and the rugged highlands of Portugal. On the surface, they claimed to be searching for relics associated with the Holy Grail and early Aryan culture. But if you sharply flip through those files, you will see a notation repeated like an obsession. NBM, Nigrum Bellatoris Militia, the Latin phrase meaning the Black Warrior Order. They knew something, or at least they were sniffing out the scent of something beyond comprehension. A diary recovered from one such expedition, commanded by SS officer Otto Rahn, ripped open the veil of mystery. Rahn was no ordinary soldier. He was an eccentric scholar, a Holy Grail theorist who spent years wandering among the desolate ruins of the Cathars and ghostly locations that once belonged to the Templars. In a hurried entry, his handwriting seemingly shaking in 1938, Rahn wrote, "They have not vanished at all. They have simply changed attire. The mantle is now the shadow, but the cross still burns. We are not the first to search. We are not even the ones who came closest." 3 months later, Otto Rahn died. Officially, reports stated he committed suicide on the snow-covered slopes of the Alps, but unofficially, you and I both know what the SS did to those who knew too much. Ron was permanently silenced. Why did Ron become a threat? Because he had touched upon a truth unacceptable to the Nazi ruling clique. He implied that the Black Templars were still breathing, not as a fragile thread of myth and folklore, but as an anonymous, organized entity operating entirely outside any framework of nation, race, or ideology. To put it bluntly, they could not be controlled. And if there was one thing in this world that drove the fascist gang mad with rage, it was a supreme power into which they could not plunge their hands to manipulate. However, the Ahnenerbe files were not yet closed. After Berlin fell, the Soviet Red Army confiscated a set of records containing a detail so unsettling it was kept completely hushed for decades. The year 1942. Avignon, France. Beneath a church plowed through by bombs and shells, the Germans discovered a Templar seal, a black cross wrapped by a snake, driven deep into the bedrock. When they laboriously smashed through the stone layer to enter the cellar below. Well, guess what? Empty. Completely cleaned out down to the last scrap. The dust in the cellar was still fresh. Traces indicated it had been cleared out just weeks before the boot heels of the German army managed to step onto the town. They were always a step too late. A ghost was always ahead of them. Even Hitler, during private late-night conversations, documents historians call table talk, once confusedly mentioned an ancient core of Europe concealed beneath centuries of decay. He once craved to compare his SS forces not to modern armies, but to silent knights observing from the shadows. He wanted to become them, but he was merely a twisted and morbid imitation. As the war drew to a close, while Berlin sank into a sea of fire and the Thousand-Year Reich writhed in its death throes, a tightly sealed train quietly left the station, heading south. Destination unknown. Soviet intelligence insisted it carried plundered artwork. American intelligence asserted it was gold bullion. But an OSS agent, the predecessor of the CIA, embedded in Lisbon at the time, sent a top-secret telegram with contents that made skin crawl. Leaked rumors across inner Vatican channels say that train carried no treasure. It carried a proof. Proof of an order that continued to exist out of the ashes. What shape did that proof take? What was its weight? Not a soul knows. That train simply evaporated off the face of the earth. Just like everything else that touched the edge of the Black Templars, its track was severed right before the precipice of disclosure. Do you see the core difference here? The Nazis craved to find a trigger. They wanted to use that ancient knowledge as a weapon to dominate the world. But what about the Black Templars? Their ultimate principle was secrecy placed above dominion, memory placed above manipulation. The Nazis failed, or more accurately, they were rejected. So, a terrifying question is raised. Could it be that those black-clad ghosts silently monitored the Third Reich from the shadows, not to join them, but to ensure that they faded away? It sounds crazy until you look at the pattern of mysterious sabotage targeting key projects of Nazi Germany. Top-secret codes were inexplicably disabled. Archaeological sites were breached and disrupted from within. Officers trusted to the utmost suddenly vanished without a trace or were catastrophically discredited, often right after they ventured too close to areas related to the temple. Who was the culprit? The names scattered repeatedly throughout incident reports all belonged to small men, unremarkable, low-ranking, Men who served as gatekeepers, couriers, cleaners, never caught, never found, always evaporating right at the coordinates linked to black-marked files. Coincidence? I don't think so. They were not treasure guards. They were the guardians of boundaries. They were there to make sure that the power once betrayed by kings in 1307 would not be touched and defiled by another tyrant ever again. In the flickering twilight of the 20th century's darkest chapter, amid bombs and fanaticism, they struck once more. Very quietly, no flags flying, no drums beating. They clad themselves not in rattling steel armor, but in the dense darkness of history. It should have been a peaceful place for humans to escape this decaying world. Rennes-le-Château, a village with a handful of inhabitants perched precariously on a hilltop in southern France, where the sheep population vastly outnumbered the people. A tiny dot, forgotten among the lush, green ridges and ruined chapels of the Languedoc region. Yet, you know the scent of money and the mystical. It attracts flies. Since the late 19th century, this sleepy commune has become a magnet tightly drawing paranoid treasure hunters, half-baked mystics, and occasionally a priest who suddenly grew greedy with wealth falling from the sky. Well, you are all too familiar with this script, aren't you? A dirt-poor village pastor accidentally digs up something. Suddenly he builds a church with lavish, excessive style, throws money around like trash, and then dies miserably in circumstances so bizarre that no one dares to investigate. People whisper about a cellar full of gold, a heretical gospel cursed by the church, or some terrifying truth buried alive. But forget that superficial gold. The true turning point, the moment the veil was ripped open, didn't come until 1972. In the spring of that year, the atmosphere was dense with mist. Local police received an anonymous tip. Someone was conducting illegal excavations beneath Magdala Tower, that bizarre neo-Gothic structure built by none other than the infamous priest Bérenger Saunière himself. The police officers, yawning, carried their gear there at dawn, convinced they would nab a few amateur grave robbers. But what they actually found was something that permanently altered their worldview. According to a secret report, the kind later leaked in fragments to a French journalist, the scene at that moment was spine-chillingly silent. Only the distant clanking of bells worn on goats' necks echoed down from the hills. As the officers shone their flashlights near the base of the tower, they saw freshly dug damp soil, a smashed iron padlock, and one officer was so terrified he dropped the flashlight right out of his hand. Next to the gaping stone structure, there stood a silhouette. Clad in a black cloak, he stood motionless like a statue sculpted from the night. He didn't utter a word, didn't flee, didn't panic. He just stood there, staring straight at the trembling gun barrels. His face was swallowed by a deep hood, his gloved hands loosely hanging down. And then, with a fluid, absurd movement that violated every law of physics, that black shadow turned and vanished into the grove behind the estate. There wasn't even the sound of a footstep stepping on dry leaves, leaving no trace. It was as if he had never existed. Once they gathered their wits and entered the excavation site, the police found a narrow tunnel plunging straight through the floor. There lay a few rusted tools, a lantern with a wick that still retained warmth, and something that made the church break into a cold sweat, a rolled-up piece of parchment, tightly sealed with red wax. Upon that wax layer was a ruthlessly familiar sigil, a black cross flaring at the edges, with a twisted snake slithering along its spine. This seal matched down to the millimeter a seal blacklisted by Vatican investigators in 1923, and the exact same object driven into the stone floor at Avignon right before the Nazi forces. It was preserved in the Vatican Black Book under the abbreviation NM, Nigrum Militum. This was no foul treasure hunt. Intricate diagrams scribbled on the ground showed that this excavation followed the alignment of the ancient Merovingian era, connecting the Magdalene altar straight to far-off mountain ranges. It was a ritual map. Under interrogation, the villagers denied it stubbornly. But an old shepherd, his eyes murky with fear, tremblingly whispered about La Sentinelle Noire, the Black Sentinel, a ghost who had been spotted decades prior, also during a mysterious digging. Many said it was a hoax, but my friend, the most haunting detail lay not in the seal or the map. It lay within the scribbled note on the margin of the final report page by the officer present that day. He moved as if he had been doing this for centuries. This observation recalls a terrifying uniformity. The nameless Venetian master, the Ottoman mercenary reciting a Latin oath, the black cloaked envoy in Portugal. All of them were described with the same timeless, silent, and absolutely emotionless aura, as if they were not merely inheriting a tradition, but were themselves a presence that had never departed. But why then? Why the year 1972? During the height of Cold War tensions, perhaps it was a warning sent to Western intelligence agencies scouring for supernatural power. Or perhaps, after centuries of silence deep within the grave, it was merely a proud nod from the order in the shadows, a smirking whisper from the edge of the world. Hey, we are still here. Decades after that event, one of the officers from back then, now an old man lying on his deathbed in a Marseille hospital, gripped his son's hand and confessed a secret. The old man said that the figure standing beneath the hood that night was not human. When the son pressed further, the old man closed his eyes tight, his breath a faint whisper. He carried with him the stillness of thousands of lives and looked at me as if I were a newborn baby. We have traveled a very long road together, across scorching battlefields, cobwebbed crypts, archives drenched in both ink and blood. From a scattered legend, the Black Templars have manifested into a system, an idea that resolutely refuses to die. It is very easy for us to smirk and throw this concept into the same trash bin as flying saucers or alchemy. But what makes this hypothesis terrifying to the extreme lies in its simplicity. That order never died. The event of 1314, when the Templar leaders were burned alive, was not annihilation. It was a strategic retreat. They were not defeated on the battlefield. They were stabbed in the back by the legal paperwork of the King of France and the Pope. The massive wealth, the powerful fleets, the dozens of commanderies. Where did they disappear to? One half of the temple, the compromising group, donned the white mantle with the red cross once more, operating publicly under the name Order of Christ in Portugal. They became navigators, pioneers setting sail into the great oceans. But what about the other half? The unyielding, ruthless, and unbowed half. They retreated into the shadows. They refused to wear the white mantle defiled by betrayal. They chose the night not to flee, but for camouflage. They needed no papal approval. They required no registry. They operated inside primeval forests, in abandoned monasteries. And look at the rhythm of their appearances. How terrifying. They only rose from the shadows during moments when the world was engulfed in turmoil. Monarchies collapsed, empires fractured. They appeared not to save humanity. They observed. to record what bled through the fractures of the eras. Some believe they are waiting for the day Solomon's house is rebuilt. Others believe in a prophecy of sacred bloodlines. But there is a darker, far more brutal assumption that the Black Templars are a brotherhood of judgment. They swore allegiance to no church or throne. They only swore to themselves, and they are here to settle the score. So then, are we staring into the past? No. If this phantom lineage is real, they are no museum relics. They are our contemporaries. They are breathing the exact same air as us. People always preach that the past has been sealed beneath layers of dust, that the ghosts have shut their mouths. But sometimes, if you know how to pay attention, if you listen not for loud sounds, but for the missing deadly silence, you will feel it. Not a memory, not history, but a presence, watching, without blinking. And now, as the darkness closes in around you, as I am about to depart, there is a final thought that keeps lingering in my mind. What if all this time you weren't following their tracks, but they were the ones deliberately leading you? The lights have dimmed. Somewhere, deep within primeval forests or beneath ancient stone, men dressed in black are still kneeling, not to pray, but to wait. Their armor has rusted, but their eyes are still there, always watching, and perhaps, just perhaps, they have already seen you. Good night.